Today I'm speaking with Keith Giles. Keith, thank you so much for joining me today.
Tim, it's an honor. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to speaking with you for a while. I've watched a number of your videos over the last few months, and I've been watching more and seeing you on Facebook and so forth, seeing your posts, and you're fascinating. And I saw you on Pine Creek a while ago, and that was fascinating. I think you've been on there a couple times, but I only saw one of them, but that was interesting enough. And your flying man conversation. But
Yes.
I've been looking forward to chatting with you. And I do just want to give, before I give a bio for Keith, I want to give everyone just a heads up. Keith is a theist, and I know that for a lot of people that watch my channel, you are atheists or you're very close to it, and you are used to that. I'm not always going to interview atheists, and I think there's some conversations to be had where we can express, with civilness, that we want to understand where each other's coming from and build bridges. And so that's my heart. I definitely don't want to be painting people as bad just because they don't agree with me. That was where we came from as fundamentalists. We don't want to do that as atheists. But I do want to just make sure I'm clear on that. But anyway, to go into the bio, Keith Giles grew up in El Paso, Texas. Keith, correct me on this at the end if I'm wrong on anything. He and his wife, Wendy, worked with Peace Catalyst International to help build relationships between Christians and Muslims in El Paso, Texas. Keith was formerly a licensed and ordained minister who walked away from organized church over a decade ago to start a home fellowship that gave away 100% of the offering to the poor in the community. He does not preach sermons anymore, if I'm understanding that correctly. You're also the author of the best-selling Jesus Un series, meaning like Jesus Unforsaken, substituting divine wrath with unrelenting love, a whole series of books there. You're the author of books, a recent book as well that came out called, well, I'll ask you, what's the most recent book? I'd love to hear your description of it as well here.
Yeah. So we I guess a quick setup. So there's something called the Gospel Coalition, which talk about triggering. It's not they're not very nice most of the time, put it that way. The Gospel Coalition is a very strong fundamentalist, Calvinistic sort of blog website. And they put out a book on spiritual deconstruction called Before You Lose Your Faith. And a bunch of friends of mine who are also authors, when we heard about it, our immediate reaction was, we need to have a response book, because we knew automatically what their take on deconstruction of faith, basically having questions about your faith. They were going to take a certain posture. And so we wrote a response book. Our book came out maybe a week after theirs. The day it came out, it was number one. It's still number one as this recording in the category. And the point was just to offer another perspective for people. So their book was called Before You Lose Your Faith. Our book is called Before You Lose Your Mind. And it's a collection of authors contributing chapters, basically trying to let people know, hey, if you're asking questions about your faith, you're on the right track. It's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. Don't let anybody make you feel bad about it. And so that we just want people to know it's okay to be in that place of questioning and not really knowing the answers to things. So that was the reason we put that book out, and I'm really proud of it. It's done really well, amazing. By the way, it's 99 cents on Kindle. That is the price forever. It's not a sale price. It'll always be that price. And then the print book is $9.99. So we wanted to make it as affordable as possible for as many people as possible to get a hold of it.
Yeah, and I'll put the link for that beneath our video if anyone wants to go check it out right away. But I love that name, Before You Lose Your Mind. And that's just pretty much what it comes down to. Right. Keith is also the co-host of the Heretic Happy Hour podcast, which has featured interviews with people that some of us know, like Bart Ehrman, Brad Jurczyk, Greg Boyd, and many others. You also teach several online courses, such as Square One, From Deconstruction to Reconstruction, and other courses based on your many books. And your website is just keithgiles.com, which I'll have beneath our video again. And is it correct you were the co-founder of the Pacifist Fight Club?
Oh, yes. Now we're going back in time.
Could you tell us what that is about?
So it started as a joke. There's a Christian pastor who's also a little bit toxic. His name is Mark Driscoll. And so
just a little bit.
Oh gosh, yeah. Oh my gosh, that guy. So it goes back. He had said something at the time that was pretty offensive, like he usually did. And in response, I just made a joke on Twitter to some friends of mine saying, "Oh, for the record, I could totally take these two friends of mine in a cage match." And then they said, "Well, but it would be a pacifist fight club." And I said, "Oh yeah, pacifist fight club." It was a joke. But then we thought, oh, that sounds cool. Like, let's actually do this. So we actually started a blog called Pacifist Fight Club, where a bunch of Christians kind of wrote from a nonviolent, loving your enemy kind of perspective. we did a series of events in Southern California where people would come. There were free events. People would just show up and we would talk on different topics of nonviolence. And yeah, it was called Pacifist Fight Club. It was a blast. We're not really meeting together anymore, but the relationships and connections we had that started there are still, we're still connected to each other, and still in each in our own way working to promote the idea of loving our enemies, blessing those who curse us, those kinds of things in very practical ways, in a very nonviolent way. So
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I was going to say too, and I was going to say this later, but this is a good segue to it. I think as we get into the discussion, people are going to, who don't know you yet, are going to find that you are in a very unique position in that you have enemies, so to speak, philosophically on both sides. There are
Yes.
people who would say you're not really a Christian, and there are certainly atheists who would say you're way too theistic for us, for our comfort. And so
Yeah.
you kind of have people on both sides pushing you, and that must be at times a very difficult position to hold. And I know we'll get into that more, but I just want to acknowledge that you definitely, like, the whole thing that the dynamic that I've seen of Christians who look at atheists and say, why would you leave? And often Christians don't really want to really know the real reasons. They're just like, this was, why would you want to leave God's love? This doesn't make sense. But when you would say, well, let me tell you why I left, they really don't want to listen usually. I've had very few people ask me why I left, even people very close to me. They don't want to know. But in terms of like that question, you think, well, don't you realize, those of you who are Christians looking at those of us who are atheists, don't you realize we had so much to lose and we still left? We had, Pascal's wager, we had loved ones in it, family, friends, we still left. We must have a reason.
Yeah.
And you're in that spot where you got people on both sides saying that, people saying, why aren't you still with us as a Christian? And why aren't you all the way? You know so much. I've seen your videos. You know more than a lot of atheists do, and you're not an atheist. So you're in that spot where people are probably pulling you both sides.
Yeah, I'm definitely a man with no country in some respects in that, I'm too Christian for most atheists and not Christian enough for most evangelical Christians. First of all, evangelical Christians and myself tend to define what that means in different ways. I've had several debates with other Christians on questions of like, what is the gospel? And I think fundamentally most Christians, the majority of the kinds of Christians that your audience, either they were in churches like that or they themselves were a part of, a Christian organization, that the Christians in that sort of environment or ecosystem, typically in my experience, have only one way of thinking of almost everything. And because you're indoctrinated to believe that there is only one way to think about these certain doctrines and beliefs. And so therefore, if you don't agree with those things, how could you be a Christian? And so, so I definitely have had sort of contentious, not so contentious because I'm not a contentious person, but I definitely have had sort of online conversations where we would disagree, trying to just present another way of looking at some of the fundamental doctrines of what has become modern Christianity. And so you're right. But I kind of like you, I'm always open to having a conversation with somebody who doesn't agree with me. I actually enjoy that. I actually, whether that person identifies as a Christian or a Muslim or an atheist or whatever, Buddhist or whatever, I take the posture that I don't know everything. I have something I can learn. And actually, every time I've engaged with somebody who I didn't agree with, I did learn something. And if you think about it, that just makes sense. If I'm only surrounding myself with people that agree with me all the time, who's going to challenge me? How am I ever going to learn something new? No one's ever going to give me a new idea because we're all supposed to agree, right? So I actually welcome that. And I guess that because of that, that's going to put me in this place where a lot of Christians don't know what to do with me. And a lot of atheists, I'm sure, just go, is this guy really a Christian?
Well, I don't mean this offensively at all, but I know when I was a Christian, I definitely would have, after having listened to some of your videos, I would have said at that point, you're not a real Christian. I mean, obviously at this point, I have no dog in the fight, the bone in the fight, but I would have definitely said you're more than a liberal Christian. But or more liberal than most liberal Christians I knew, and that the gospel was diluted so far that there wasn't really much left. But it is interesting, and I look for I want to get into that in a minute too. I want to hear where you've landed, but I do also want to first start with where your journey was. Before I do that, one last icebreaker question, so to speak.
Okay.
In one of your videos, someone called you Sasquatch. What did that refer to?
Okay, so that is an inside joke. So when you mentioned my wife Wendy and I several years ago had started this church where we gave everything away to the poor in the community, and we did that for like 11 years. That was in Southern California, and so we met in homes. That was the only way, because we didn't have to pay rent for a building. We just met in people's houses, and I got a job like in the real world like everybody else, and to take care of my family, and that way all the offerings could go and help people in our community, who were living in motels or were homeless, whatever. And so in that context, in our little house church community, I don't even know how to say where it started, but one of the people in the group, because I would kind of talk back a little bit, I'm a little sarcastic sometimes, and so that was kind of like being sassy. They started calling me the Sasquatch, and that was just one of my little nicknames.
Gotcha. That's funny.
And really, it's only the people that run our house church. Like, no one really calls me that except for people who are part of our house church community.
Gotcha.
That's where that came from. Yeah.
Very cool. Yes, being a little sassy is good. Well, I wanted to just give a starting point, a kind of a spot for you to open up to your story. I know we have a lot to talk about in terms of where you are now, but I'd love to just hear your background and kind of how you grew up and what it's been like over the years, especially before you were a pastor. And then certainly I'd love to hear a little bit more about what that was like and not just what it was like experientially, but what you actually believed and kind of what the different gates were that you went through.
Yeah. So, in many ways, I feel like my story is probably typical of most white male Christians who were raised Southern Baptist in America. So, I'm an only child. I was raised in a Christian home. So, from the time I was like probably 8 or 9 years old was when my family sort of like joined a church and, went forward and got baptized and all that. Prior to that, we didn't go to church. We didn't. So I had plenty of time as a younger person, not going to church, not really having any sort of formal Christian background, but fairly young, 9, 10 years old, joined the church and all that stuff. And grew up in that environment, raised mostly Southern Baptist in El Paso, Texas. So as you might imagine, I also grew up as somebody who voted straight ticket Republican, had a lot of guns, was a member of the NRA, was firmly convinced that you could not be a follower of Jesus and vote for Bill Clinton or anybody who wasn't, the Republican Party nominee. And that was, that's just the way it was. And so in that environment, I just repeated everything I ever heard from the pulpit without ever really questioning it. And I'm embarrassed to say, I spent time in my college years. I was in a Christian band here in El Paso for like 5 years.
Can I ask you a quick question about the Republican thing?
Yeah.
This is theoretical, so I don't, you may have to say you don't know, but if you could imagine that your path hadn't really changed much, so let's say that you were still in that, Republican Christianity, conservative, king and country kind of thing, God and country, and you had stayed consistent in that up to Donald Trump. Do you think Donald Trump would have affected your stance on evangelicalism if nothing else had changed before then?
Well, who could say in an alternate reality, right? If things had turned out differently. What scares me is to think that, if I had never left that world, let's say if I'd never left El Paso, stayed here, continued to be influenced by my church, my denomination, because I was licensed and ordained here, I most likely would have continued to be employed in a Southern Baptist church. Once you gain some sort of leadership, now my job depends on it, all that kind of stuff. It's scary for me to say, but probably, and I say it's likely only because even as everything within me wants to scream no, I would have to admit, it might have been harder to break away from that. Like if I had spent more years sort of buying into that and not questioning that. And I say that also because I have a lot of friends and family members today, I'm sad to say, who have drank the Kool-Aid and who still, I've watched them go from being people, in the previous election, when it was Hillary versus Trump, held their nose and voted for Trump and vocally said, I don't like this guy. He's dishonest. He's crass. He's crude. I don't like him, but I'm going to vote for him just because he's the Republican, right? And now those same people in my family are now like waving the Trump flag. He's the greatest thing ever. He can do no wrong. He's God's chosen man. And I'm like, what happened? How did you get from there to where you are now? In just a few years, right? So I definitely see that it happened, and I definitely recognize there was. I definitely bought into that, right? I mean, I had a very strong break from that, and I wrote my first book in that Jesus series is Jesus Untangled, Crucifying Our Politics to Pledge Allegiance to the Lamb, and the whole inspiration for that book was my own sort of awakening to the realization that, oh my gosh, I'm more Republican than Christian. I don't know where these two things begin and the other ends, right? And I had a real sort of like struggle, a crisis of conscience, right? To reevaluate, wait a second. If I'm supposed to be following this Jesus of Nazareth guy, what is he really all about? And I read the Sermon on the Mount and caring for the poor and, loving your enemies and all this stuff. And I look at the Republican Party, they are not the same. They are not going the same direction, right? That was just the Republican Party. These before Trump even. So I'm glad I kind of had that realization before the Trump thing came along. But I can definitely see how it's a sort of a psychosis. And if you don't awaken from it, if something doesn't shake you out of it, and you don't suddenly notice that, hey, most of the people on this planet who call themselves Christians are not Democrats or Republicans or Americans. So it is possible to genuinely be a follower of Jesus and not vote Republican or Democrat and not identify that way. And I realized I needed to do that. It was a better thing to move away from that. And I think, but I see most Christians are really stuck in it. So
yeah, it almost reminds me of some of the nationalism that we see around Israel, where it's almost like we become the big second Israel, and we can. God's on our side, so why wouldn't you want to go that route? And I was curious. I may have missed this, but when you were talking about your childhood and working through that, was there a specific time where you had if you're a Southern Baptist, I imagine you had an altar call. Was there a time where you remember actually saying like a sinner's prayer or something?
Oh yeah, I mean that's what happened. When I was like 9 years old, I walked forward and prayed the prayer. My mom and dad and I were all baptized together, and all of that.
By sprinkling, right?
Oh no, we were dunked. We're in the flood. We're Baptist, man.
I'm just kidding. Yeah,
the official way, right?
gotta be dunked. And
I don't really care anymore, but I mean, at the time, that was the way, right?
I assume hell was literal fire and all that? Yes,
yeah, those are some of the things that I mentioned earlier that I used to kind of I'm just parroting back what I was told, right?
Yeah.
I remember saying things like standing up at college campus here in El Paso or some high school campus or wherever my band was playing. It was a Christian band, so we were very evangelistic. We would do a concert, of course, then somebody, me or my friend JJ, would kind of get a little message and an altar call. Yeah. And I would repeat things like, I just heard this, right? Every soul is eternal. The only question is where you will spend it, in heaven or in hell. And then later on, wasn't much later on, I realized, there's nothing in the Bible that ever says that, ever. Like, why am I saying that? Oh, it was because I heard Pastor Bob saying that. But I just assumed he knew what he was talking about. Like, that isn't what it says. So, but anyway, no, I mean, I just accepted eternal torment. I thought that there's no other way to believe that. No one ever taught me, that by the way, this is something that I did some research on. One of my books is on the Doctrine of Hell, and just some shocking things that I discovered about sort of like early church history. So, for example, like the first 400 years of church history, the majority Christian view was universal reconciliation, that every single human being would be saved. The majority of Christians for 400 years believed that. That's why when Augustine wrote his, in favor of eternal torment, he started the document by saying, indeed, very many believers, my brothers and sisters, at this time disagree with me. So he admitted he was in the minority when he said that. Now,
Were
no one
they,
told me that. No one taught me that, right?
do you know, were
I
they
just thought,
teaching like a purgatory?
um,
Or do you
well,
know, how would
I
they,
don't know that purgatory specifically, I mean, Catholic Church played into it. It's more of the view, yeah, so there's always been historically three Christian views of hell. And this is the other big shocker. I mean, I didn't realize this, but as early as we can see, Christians have always held three views of hell. So, and again, for the first 400 years, even though there were sort of three different streams, they didn't say, oh, you don't believe in eternal torment? Well, you're a heretic and you're not going to heaven. Or you believe in universal reconciliation? Oh, you can't be a Christian and believe that. In fact, some of the major creeds of the early Christian church were overseen by councils where the leaders of that council were universal reconciliation believers, and they were happy to have that guy sit on the council because it wasn't a big deal to them. That's why the earliest creeds don't have any mention of hell, because they recognized, oh, well, we can't all agree on what we think on this, so let's just leave that part out, because let's only focus on the things we do agree on, right?
yeah.
So anyway, and then the third view is annihilation, which is that you'll die and there'll be destruction. So, but to answer your question on like how that universal reconciliation worked out, and I don't want to get too deep into this. We can cover other topics, but
Sure.
But recognizing that the universal reconciliation view, as the early Christians taught it for 400 years, was not the idea, which most Christians even assume this, not the idea that, oh, that when you die, you just you wake up in heaven and somebody hands you a party hat and a plate of food and hey, welcome, have a good time. No, it's not that everyone avoids sort of the quote unquote fires of judgment. It's the opposite. It's actually the view that the universal reconciliation view of Christians at that time was that when you die, everyone passes through the fire. Mother Teresa, Billy Graham, Gandhi, you, me, Hitler, everybody, good, bad, and different, everybody. But the view was that the fire is a metaphor for a process of being restored and renewed, right? It's not literal fire where no one's actually like striking a match, there's no real fire. That fiery judgment is a metaphor for, again, just kind of going through this purification, right? There's even an Old Testament verse where it talks about how God's judgment or whatever is a refiner's fire, and at the same time, a fuller's soap. What does soap do? It cleans, right? It cleanses, it renews, it restores.
I'm just curious, not to get off track, but what is the worm, where the worm does not die and where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth? Like, what is that? Yeah. What does that refer to?
So glad you asked me that, because most Christians this is beautiful. And I wrote a book on this, there's actually an overlap on that phrase, on whether, so as it gets used, it's used to teach either the doctrine of eternal torment or the doctrine of sort of the second coming of Jesus and like the end of the world, right? And the reason why is that's something, those phrases. So phrases, when Jesus in Matthew, what's called the Olivet Discourse, when Jesus uses these phrases and he says, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched, or there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, or the smoke of their torment rises forever and ever, right? When he says those kinds of things and he uses those phrases, he's quoting he's quoting verbatim Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, all these Old Testament prophets. And if you go and look at what those Old Testament prophets were talking about in the Old Testament when they use those phrases, they're never talking about where anybody goes after they're dead. It's, in other words, the Old Testament, if you look through the Old Testament looking for verses in the Old Testament scriptures that mention eternal torment, you'll come up with a giant goose egg. There's nothing, which again is problematic if you want to think that, well, God invented this idea of eternal torment. He just forgot to mention it for like 6,000 years. Oh, by the way, maybe I should have mentioned that, my plan is to roast people for eternity. Yeah, let's just bring that up. No, that's not what's happening. So when Jesus in the Olivet Discourse uses the same phrases, he's actually answering the question his disciples asked about his statement of that temple right there that you think is so cool. The day is coming when not one stone will be left upon another. It'll all be cast to the ground and be totally destroyed. And they're like, oh, when will that happen? Tell us the details of when that will be. And then they sit down and then he tells them what's going to happen when that temple gets destroyed, which did happen in AD 70, right? So all of the language, it's apocalyptic hyperbole. It's a metaphorical, poetic way of speaking from the Old Testament. So like, again, Jeremiah, Isaiah, all those guys in the Old Testament, when they talk about where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched and weeping and gnashing of teeth and the smoke of the torment rises forever, when they use those phrases, they're talking about this is what's going to happen to you guys when Edom is destroyed, or Egypt is destroyed, or even Jerusalem is destroyed, when invading armies come and surround you and burn you and to the ground, which is exactly what Jesus is talking about in Matthew 24 in the Olivet Discourse. He's not talking about the end of the world, and he's not talking about where anybody's going to go after they're dead. And it's a really simple thing of like, if you understand this apocalyptic hyperbole, it's a way of teaching and speaking that Jesus is borrowing from the Old Testament prophets. He's speaking about the same exact kind of an event, a very real world event, like a 9/11 kind of an event. It has nothing to do with what's going to happen after you're dead. And again, this was the view of the early Christians for about 400 years. So
Now, was this is information that you uncovered after you had become a pastor?
oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah. I mean, I really only maybe in the last 4 or 5 years started, realizing these things. And it was like other teachers some guys that I know personally, some other guys that I've just gotten to know over the years, or other books that I've read on church history have kind of just blown my mind about, I spent my whole life, I got licensed and ordained as a pastor. No one ever told me these things. This information was never given to me. You're given one view. This is indoctrination, right? This is how it works. Here's one view. It's the only view. If anybody tries to teach you anything else, they're heretics, they're false teachers, and you should run away, right?
I love that you said what you just said about no one ever told you. I've said that a lot on my channel. I know you probably are new to me, so you probably haven't heard me say this, but I said to a lot of people, I struggle with questioning how many people like at Bible college or pastors that I was under, or just pastors that I get to enjoy from a distance. I was very much a disciple, so to speak, of John MacArthur, Chuck Swindoll, David Jeremiah, a lot of people from a distance, and a lot of other people. I went to Bob Jones, went to Lancaster Bible College. I had a lot of teachers, and a lot of them, I suspect that at least some of them knew some of the things that eventually caused me to deconvert and become an atheist. And I never heard it from anybody. For example, I did not know that there were so many places in the Bible, in the New Testament, where it's quoting from other sources. Like, for example, I knew from Jude that Jude quotes Enoch. I didn't realize, but I've realized from my own study here that the New Testament quotes the book of Enoch at least 100 times.
A lot of times.
Directly.
Yeah. It shows up a lot. Yeah. And by the way, and to your point, a lot of the early Christians before the scripture was canonized, it was up to sort of before there was an official canonization of scripture, every individual sort of leader or teacher or whatever just had their own personal list. And we know this because of their writings, right? So, for some of them, I accept Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I like Hebrews. I don't like James. I like the Shepherd of Hermes. I like Book of Enoch. And so some books that we've never even heard of, the Didache. So they had their own sort of personal canon that I consider these to be scriptures and these others not so much.
And we still have that today. I'm just looking at a screenshot I took from one of your other videos, but you pointed out in one of your teachings that Eastern Orthodox still has 78.
Oh, yeah.
We, meaning we, as I'm counting myself as where I was before, but we Protestants had 66. Ethiopian Orthodox has 81. Catholic 73. Syrian Orthodox has 68. I mean, even still, there's multiple canons, and to say clearly God has preserved His word, not
clearly. Well, my tradition. It's those others He didn't care about, but He really cared about my particular strains, and that's why I bring that up, because I hear that statement all the time from Christians, that God preserved His canon and He made sure, and I'm like, well, yeah, but what about all these other Christian canons? There's multiple ones. Like, what's your argument that He cared so much about yours, but not about all those other guys? Like, they just did whatever they wanted, but He really cared about protecting ours. And the canon itself is a problem. I mean, the fact that we even got to a place where we felt like, Constantine, to me, there's a lot of things I could lay at his doorstep that I feel like he corrupted a very simple relational, faith, where it became something where it was entangled with the state. We went from carrying the cross to carrying the sword, pledging allegiance to the Roman Empire, incorporating hierarchy and pagan practices into the worship, paying the clergy, all these sorts of things, and the canonization. I mean, the whole, again, think about that, like almost 400 years, no Christian on their own said, you know, guys, we all need to agree on what are the right books that are the correct book, or even we all need to agree on it, like the basic things of a statement of faith of what it means to be a Christian. And if you believe these things, you're in, but if you don't, you're out. We didn't do that. Christians didn't do that. It was Constantine who said we needed it. And so then once we did it, as soon as we did that and we played along and we had sort of this is the true beliefs, these beliefs and only these beliefs make you a Christian, which was a shift, because before that, before Constantine, what made you a Christian was your behavior. Do you love your enemy? Do you bless the poor? Do you care for the orphan and the widow? Hey, why do you do that? Well, because I love Jesus. I follow Jesus. That's what made you a Christian. Orthopraxy. But under Constantine, all of a sudden, it's about believing these things. Do you believe these things? And then, as long as you believe those things, you can go live like a son of a bitch the rest of your day, because it doesn't really matter what you do. You're forgiven. Pray the prayer. Go to the priest or whatever. And it's this weird shift, right? That happens under Constantine. And I think the canonization is also a big problem, because it also then says that, only these books, these and only these books are acceptable. And what as a Christian, what I see is that most Christians today are more concerned about what God might have been doing and saying 2,000 years ago than what he might be doing and saying today. Yeah. And it just kind of keeps you then in this stasis. It's really about fear and control, ultimately. And I think that's honestly why Constantine did it. I think he understood this is how we're going to keep people in control. Because up to that point, right, 300 plus years of church history where Christians were tortured and persecuted, it wasn't working. In fact, they were getting stronger. They were getting bigger. And it was out of control. So it was sort of like, well, you can't beat them, join them. And I think that's kind of what happened.
One thing I wanted to point out from one of your previous videos, and I love the way you put this, and I'm probably going to misrepresent it a little bit, hopefully not, but something about the idea that a lot of Christians are putting their faith more in these men from these councils who decided the canon and so forth and what is orthodox. You're putting your faith more in men who you don't even know their names. You don't know what they stood for. You don't know if they were universalists or whatever. You don't know their background. Were they, actually righteous men, or were they just, having a facade and, they're out, doing terrible things behind the scenes. We don't know even who these people were, and we're trusting that they made the right decision. I mean, we're theologically saying, well, we trust that God had, orchestrated this, sovereignly to make sure that the right people, always men, the right men were there at the right time to keep his canon pure, and to weed out, the bad stuff, the false doctrine. But we don't even know who these people were. I mean, most people, myself included, to my shame, I couldn't name, I don't think even one person who was involved in the canonicity thing. I mean, maybe if I thought about it long enough, I'd find something from Bible college, but I don't know one name of one man who said that's definitely. I know Martin Luther had some opinions much later, but I don't know who made this canon up, and that's a problem that we're putting our faith in men that we don't even know.
That's right, and I bring those things up I just want Christians to think more and engage more about, the things they say they believe and why, and that's a huge one to me, because I feel like, unfortunately, Christians have gotten to this place where, the Bible says, so if I can open my English, here's the problem too. I can open my English translation of the Bible and I can say right here, the Bible says, and I can read it to you, and it says right there in the Bible. And you think it's over. You think the conversation's over. You think you've solved the problem. No, you haven't. And I go into this in my book, Jesus Unbound, which is looking at the scripture and pointing out not only the errors, not only the contradictions, not only the mistakes, but also the problem in the translation. So again, the problem is, yes, your English Bible, you can open it and you can read something that says da-da-da. But so many times, these key critical verses that are sort of the linchpin verses for the main doctrines of like penal substitutionary atonement, or the doctrine of hell, or the teachings about women not teaching in the church and things like that. Those are key doctrinal verses, or homosexuality, right? there are these key scriptural verses that are sort of the go-to verses that prove whatever that position or that doctrine is. And on almost every case, if you go to the English translation, the problem is, well, that word right there isn't in the Greek. For example, let's stick with the Bible. 2 Timothy 3:16, all scripture is God-breathed. Well, the problem with that in English is that if you go to the Greek, the word scripture isn't in that sentence. It's not in that verse. The Greek word for scripture doesn't appear. So why is it in your English translation? Well, it's convenient to put it there because it needs to say so. We need to beef it up a little bit. That's just one example. Gosh, there's so many examples of this kind of a thing where the more you start looking into this stuff, the more you start realizing that, I think I watched one of your videos, you pointed out, there's pseudepigrapha in your Bible. There's several letters that are attributed to Paul and to Peter. I guarantee you this, I don't care how conservative you are. I really don't believe any real scholar, a real Bible scholar, conservative or liberal, could make an argument that the guy who was the fisherman Peter wrote 1st or 2nd Peter. No possible way.
Yeah.
That Paul did not write the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. No way. He's talking about problems in the church that happened like decades after he was dead. So it can't be Paul, right? Even Ephesians and Colossians, in some ways, kind of breaks my heart because I love Ephesians and Colossians. But yeah, probably a chance he didn't write those either. 2nd Thessalonians probably didn't write that one either.
And a corollary, if you're going to include Jude and 2nd Peter and probably Revelation, then you really have to include Enoch. Like you can't, and even the Gospels, Jesus talks about, he talks to the Sadducees saying you err because you don't know the scriptures. And then he goes on to quote the Book of Enoch.
Yes.
I'm like, Jesus believes in the Book of Enoch. He quotes from it and he calls it scripture. Yes. And then Jude quotes from it. 2nd Peter quotes from it. Revelation's, all about it. It's Pythagoreanism a lot, but Enoch and Pythagoreanism on steroids. But it's like, it's just crazy. And so what's been interesting to me is kind of like you have, and we're going to get into your where you're at here in a few minutes, but sure. You've kind of evolved your story. But I've come across a lot of Christians who, like I would imagine, this is just my projection, but I would imagine that if I were to say to an average Christian something like, do you know that your New Testament is quoting the Book of Enoch at least 100 times? I've documented the quotes. Do you know it's quoting Jubilees dozens of times? Do you know it's quoting a bunch of the Qumran, quoting the Qumran community scrolls, the Sabbath sacrifice, the Holocaust document, all these Qumran documents, it's quoting and over and over and over. And what they do is the Christians say, well, that means, therefore, they should have been part of the canon. The early canonizers made a mistake. And so they basically just evolve it where they say, yes, this Enoch is clearly scripture. And they defend it vigorously. And it's been interesting to see that where instead of saying this kind of deconstructs our faith, they say this just enhances our faith. Yes, they wouldn't argue with me. They wouldn't say, they wouldn't say, no, Enoch is not quoted in the New Testament. They would say, yes, we did the research too. We agree. Therefore, Enoch is scripture. That doesn't decrease our faith in Jesus. That just gives us an extra awesome book to read. And it's really fascinating how people evolve their, like what they do with it all. And it's been interesting to see, and others where the Qumran community books are also part of the canon to them, and they love Jesus, but they know that Qumran books are part of the canon. Yeah,
and so let me go back to I think it's 1 Timothy 3:16. I said 2 Timothy. I think it's 1 Timothy. But anyway, that verse, all scripture is God-breathed, right? And as I said, the word scripture doesn't appear in the Greek. And so what it actually says is, it's not the word for scripture; it's the Greek word for just the general writings, just writings. Graphis. Right. It's the Greek word graphis. So a better way to translate that verse is really something closer to like all of the God-breathed writings are useful for teaching and instruction and training and righteousness and etc. And so I think a better way to understand that passage, at least this is how I look at it. It's more like saying it's more of an expanded view. In other words, any writing, in a general sense. Any writings are quote unquote God-breathed if those writings are useful for training in righteousness and, like in other words, living your life in a way that benefits yourself and your fellow man. And that could be the Book of Enoch. If it's the Book of Enoch, great. If it's the Lord of the Rings, if it's C.S. Lewis, if it's I don't know, Buddha, Gandhi, whatever. I mean, if it's a writing that does this, that feeds your soul, that gives you life, that gives you direction and wisdom, that helps you in some way, that's a quote unquote God breathed text. And I think the problem is a lot of Christians take this view of inspiration. We've pushed it to this level where to say that the scriptures are inspired, if you say it's inspired, then what you have to then accept is it's inerrant and infallible, and God wrote it. No, that's not what that means. For something to be inspired, it just means if there's a God, all right, and I believe in a God. So I feel like anything, it's something I read, it's a song I hear on the radio, it's a conversation I'm having with you or anybody, and I feel like in that moment there's some wisdom imparted to me. There's like an aha moment in that conversation or in what I'm reading. That I would call that an inspired moment. Does that mean God wrote it? No. Does that mean that sentence or that thing I read or that statement you said over coffee is inerrant and infallible? Let's say, what are you even talking about? That's the wrong question to ask, right? And so I personally just have a more open-ended approach to this idea of scripture. This is why I think the canonization was a bad idea, because it just limits it to only these 66 books, and then nothing else outside of that can be helpful or useful. To even say the word scripture is to sort of elevate this authority over you. Again, I think that's also a huge mistake, because it isn't even just the scripture, right? It's pastors, teachers. This idea that if someone's a pastor, someone's a teacher of the Bible, the scripture, then you should submit to them. Why? What that makes no sense. If they teach me something and it's beneficial to me, I'll say thank you. I'm grateful, but it doesn't mean I need to I'm not underneath them. They're not in charge of me. You know what I mean? Yeah. That's a weird dynamic, and I think that really only came in with the canonization of scripture and the elevation of this pastoral priestly role of this authority, top-down kind of controlling thing. And I would just say anytime there's fear or manipulation or shame or guilt, your red flag should go off. Aha, someone's trying to use this to control me and manipulate me. You're right, and you should run.
I love it. I can definitely agree with you on that. Can I ask just a more of a broad question here as we go into the next part of this? You're talking about specific issues such as hell and canonicity, but one of the experiences that a lot of people have at that point, when they realize that even if they haven't come to the conclusions like you did, if they're just starting to read stuff, maybe they stumble across a Bart Ehrman video or even Horror of Horrors, they've come across Hitchens, and they all of a sudden red flags, like, okay, something's up here, I need to figure out. But this doesn't sound like the Christianity that I grew up with. Yeah. But so and so made a really good point. I need to put it to bed, and maybe the spidey senses in you say, I know that once I figure this out, I'm going to be able to go back to my good old King James faith, and I know it's going to just be solidified. My apologetic will only get stronger as I get the answers. But the process of opening that door a crack and saying, something doesn't sound right, I need to find an answer to it. To a lot of people, that is extremely, number one, it's scary, because if they've never done it before and they've never had anyone around them do it, it's just like, what is this? But then, for example, you mentioned the discrepancies, realizing that maybe there really are two stories being merged together in the creation story. Maybe there are two stories of Noah being merged together. All of a sudden, when you're like, that actually sounds like that might be true. Or even the big one of the big ones, maybe evolution, they look at a science show, maybe it's not even the Bible. They're like, all of a sudden, maybe 6,000 to 10,000 years isn't possible for the age of the earth. And they're like, they're not even really seriously questioning it. They're just like saying, this is interesting, let's dive in. Yep. But as you dive in, and if it doesn't quickly get resolved, which of course, if you really are a good student, it doesn't, you begin to realize you're kind of peeling back the onion, and it gets very scary. And for a lot of people, they get a lot of ostracization to go any further. Like don't go there. That's the devil's tempting you to not believe. And as Pine Creek would say, I believe the whole idea of is faith the virtue or is doubt the virtue? And so my question is not as much what do you believe, faith is a virtue or doubt, but the question is, how did you deal with the fear And even the sense of like saying, I know up to this point, God is the judge. He judges me. He tells me the truth, and I simply listen and obey. All of a sudden, you're putting yourself kind of in the skeptic and critic's role. You're kind of becoming a little bit of a judge of what is truth, as opposed to simply the recipient and obedient, servant of the lawgiver. To a lot of people, that feels very offensive, feels blasphemous, even a little bit of it. How did you deal with opening yourself up to being able to do that without being like, you know what, I'm going to be in hot water for this one with God?
Right. Well, yeah. And that's that whole deconstruction. We call it, a lot of people call it deconstruction of faith, right? I think a couple of things are important to keep in mind. Like for somebody going through that, or someone who finds himself in that place. Number one, God didn't write the Bible. People did. We did, right? So that's number one. It's written by a bunch of primitive people who thought that, a lot of things that we would just go, no, you're totally off on that, right? They were writing in a very primitive way of trying to understand. I'm talking about the Old Testament specifically, right? Trying to make sense of why bad things happen in the world, and God must be angry, and how can we make that God happy? Well, let's kill something innocent. Let's sacrifice something. Maybe that'll make him happy. And we do that, and it seems like everything's better now. Well, look, that must have worked. Let's keep doing that, right? So that's part of it. But I mean, this whole the whole initial thing, I think you started off saying, you've got faith, and then you start to have some doubts. Like, Pine Creek's thing is faith the virtue, is doubt the virtue. So I want to always remind people of something. I think this is helpful, is to recognize the opposite of faith isn't doubt. It's not faith versus doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty. And I think that's what I came in contact with. I think that's what a lot of people raised in the church start to realize. I mean, initially you do believe that doubt is the opposite of faith. And that's why it scares the crap out of you that you're starting to doubt, because, now I'm moving away from faith. I'm moving to doubt. Oh no, I'm losing it all. But if you can recognize that the opposite of faith is actually certainty. Like faith, I think the idea of faith should contain the concept of mystery, of I think, or I don't know, I believe, but that doesn't mean I know, right? And so that's one of the things I think is a huge problem. I think Christianity hasn't done itself any favors over the last 500 years, I should say. Over the last 500 years since the Reformation, we have been slowly moving further and further with more and more confidence that we know these things, and we don't. Let's just be honest, we don't. And this is why, we run into these things. And then, of course, then to hold up the facade that we know, people that are in our club, we tell them, don't go out there, don't read those guys, don't listen to those guys, don't read those books, don't read Bart Ehrman, don't listen to those people. And that's the only way we're going to keep this thing together, because the minute they go and find out we're full of crap, it's going to fall apart, right? So again, I just feel like that's just a fundamental mistake. And that's part of what's created this avalanche of people running away from faith, because now they're doubting and they're going, well, maybe this isn't true. This doesn't even, like I'm saying, some things I'm realizing aren't even consistent with Christianity, historic Christianity, right? That I was told my whole life, this is the only way to think of this, of the cross or hell or whatever. And so as you have questions, as you have doubts about these things, what I try to encourage people is to say, it's okay to say I think, it's okay to say I don't know, to hold loosely to the things you think you believe, and and it's not easy. I recognize, because I've gone through it myself. I talk to people every day who are going through these kinds of things. It's extremely painful, like you said. It's really scary. Most of the time when you go through this, you will go through it alone. Because if you tell your pastor about it, you're out. If you tell your spouse, she's your husband or your wife, they're probably going to be like, well, I don't know who you are anymore. You're going to experience extreme rejection of family, friends, and fellowship. You're going to be kicked out of the church or pushed to the side. You're taken out of leadership if you're teaching Sunday school. Well, we can't let you do that anymore. So you're being pushed farther and farther away. You're losing any support system that you thought you could depend on, right? You call each other family in the church until, oh, you don't believe that anymore? Well, surprise, you're not really in anymore. I can't have you over for coffee anymore. I can't go hunting with you or camping with you anymore. I don't even understand this. you can't go camping with me, or you can't go shooting hoops with me because now I don't agree with you on the doctrine of eternal torment. Really? Is that important to shooting hoops? I don't understand why that's such an important thing, but it is.
No, you're just
right?
giving an example of what people face, or did you face some of that ostracization as well?
I did. Yes, I did definitely. Because it's this progression, right? So my first big sort of doubt about the thread that I first pulled on for me, the first one was the gospel. Like it was this recognition as an adult who had been a pastor, licensed and ordained for years, and served in churches and preached sermons and all that. Someone just pointed out to me, like, the gospel isn't about saying a prayer so you can go to heaven when you die. I was like, what? Well, Jesus never says that. Go read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, okay? Jesus says the good news is, and he never says, pray this, raise your hand if you don't want to go to hell. Never says that. It's not about that. He says the good news is the kingdom of God is right here. The kingdom of God is within you. You can experience the presence of God right now where you are in this moment. Not after you're dead, right now. That was the gospel. I was like, whoa, I didn't even know that. So the minute I made that shift, that changed a lot of things. Personally. The second thing was the idea of the definition of church. Like, what is church? The way we were doing church, the CEO up front who gets the salary, and we all sit and listen to him talk for an hour, and then we go home and are, all that kind of thing. Like, I realized, no, I don't think that's at all the way the early church, and I know it isn't. I looked into it, right? That's not how the church originally used to come together. That's not what it was all about. So anyway, the more I started questioning those things, and then, I'm a writer, I'm a speaker, I'm a blogger. I would write about these things, talk about these things. And I got, uninvited to parties. I got called a false teacher, and I still do. I mean, this is 15 years later. Yeah. I'm still being called a false teacher, and people warning me. And I go to speak at, I'm supposed to speak somewhere, and then I get people, pastors in the area, just Google my name. And you're gonna. This guy denies, the inerrancy of Scripture. This guy thinks it's okay to be gay. This guy is, I'm against all the things that they're for. Do
you get the messages that you're gonna burn in hell for what you're doing?
Oh, of course, yeah. And I'm leading people astray. It's not just that I'm going to do that. It's that I have influence. People follow me. They listen to me, and I'm responsible for leading all these people into eternal torment, which is hilarious to me because I don't believe in that. So it's like I don't know how that's supposed to influence me in any way. I'm like, nope, I don't think that's going to happen. So
I get those a lot too. Of course, I'm a little bit more on the further edge of. I'm just, I'm very much
an atheist.
I'm a militant atheist, so I'm on
totally
the fringe. Yeah, it's funny. I get those messages on Facebook or on YouTube, and sometimes I'll just write back like, "Hey, I hope you have a blessing on your journey, and hope it's just, I hope you're doing
well." That's the right way to respond.
And they'll write back like, "It doesn't really matter. You're still going to burn." And it's very sad to see that. But you definitely, when you deconstruct or deconvert, you definitely learn to develop a thick skin, or else you're just going to have to go into hiding because it's going to hurt too much. But
and by the way, some people, I'm sorry.
No, please go ahead.
I just want to talk about that. Like a lot of people that I talk to who are going through this, questioning their faith, deconstruction of their faith, they haven't experienced that rejection because they haven't told anybody. And when they tell me that, I'll say, well, I'm guessing the reason why you haven't told your pastor or your spouse or your parents or whoever it is that you're having these doubts is you probably suspect that if you did, you would be rejected. And I want you to know you're right about that. So that self-preservation instinct, you're right? So that is still, sometimes people can fully deconstruct. Listen, I do these courses, right? Square One is this course I put together. I've been doing it for like 2 years now. It's like a 90-day course for people that are questioning their faith and trying to help them walk through the process. I don't tell them what to believe. I just kind of help them figure out on their own where they want to go next. And let me tell you, man, every time I take about 15 to 20 people at a time through this 90-day course. I'm about to, in fact, I just started this week, the 8th round of that. Okay. And every single time there's at least one, sometimes 2 or 3 pastors in these groups. They are employed by a church, and they will say in these groups, which are private, if my congregation knew that I didn't believe in eternal torment or inerrancy of Scripture or the bodily resurrection of Jesus or whatever, I would lose my job. I would probably get fired. I would, who knows what would happen to me. And they're terrified that someone's going to find out, and they're conflicted. What do I do? Right? Do I keep going to my job and this is all I know? Or do I go sell insurance or work for Walmart? I mean, if your resume is, you've got a master's of divinity and you've preached, sermons for 20 years, how is that going to help you, in the corporate world? It won't.
And especially if you're going all the way out, like if you're going to liberal Christianity, there's certainly a niche for that if you look in the right spots. But if you're like, I have a master in divinity and I think it's all mythology and none of it's ever been real, like 100% of it, there's pretty much like it is time to go get another degree. Yeah.
Yes.
But yeah, or at least write a book about it. Hope it takes off. I do want to ask you, eventually merge to more where you've landed, and I won't be, of course, debating on it, but I do want to kind of ask you a little bit more about it and just throw some ideas about it. But I do want to ask about something you touched on, and that is the idea of sometimes when people are deconstructing or deconverting, they have a spouse that is not, going along with this, perhaps, or not even aware at first. I certainly have people that reach out to me a lot. I'm sure you do too, where they're scared of sharing it, or they have shared it, but they're just scared of where it's going to lead to.
Yeah.
And that's one of the hardest parts of this is the people that are closest to us, especially when you're married, if there's kids involved. And I'm just curious, number one, what happened in your situation? Did you all deconstruct together, or was it separately? And was it a hard road to where one of you went first and then the other? And then secondarily, like as you're counseling people who are going through this, in terms of specifically marriages, where they not talking, I know there's a lot of different scenarios, but not talking about people who just say, I've deconstructed and my spouse is a conservative Christian, so I want to get divorced. Not talking about those. If you want to get divorced, that's a different subject. But people that say, I'm deconstructing, I love my spouse, otherwise I have no reason to leave them. I hope they have no reason to leave me. I want to make this work. Those kind of people. So that is my second question: is how do you help those people that want to make it work, but they're on two different pages altogether?
Yeah.
Especially when you're talking about the more polar opposites, where it's like either liberal to fully deconverted, and this is like conservative, literal 6 to 10,000 year old Earth, especially inerrancy, canonicity, all that, where they're just like, there's really no way it's basically an unequally yoked situation.
Oh yeah.
Very clearly defined, light and darkness. Both people basically thinking it's as good as if you're trying to introduce heroin to our family, and you're trying to call it good and it's really, really bad. You're trying to be a drug dealer or something, and you're both seeing each other as doing something pretty toxic, and yet you have to walk side by side. Like, how do you help people with that?
Yeah, well, that is probably one of the hardest things, Tim. Real quick, I'll just say in my case, I'm very fortunate that my wife, Wendy, and I have changed my views on lots of things over the years. And at every turn, when I would sort of have my big moment of aha, or my big, oh, wow, I don't believe this anymore, and I would talk to Wendy about it, she would already be on the same page. It almost felt like she was waiting for me to catch up to her, And I asked her one time, have you always just been here and you're waiting for me to catch up to you? And she goes, no, it's because you process everything verbally. So like if I'm reading a book or if I'm thinking about something, I'm always like, well, check this out. Let me read this to you. What do you think about that? And so I'm always verbally processing with her all along the way. And I think so that's so every time I turn that corner or move away from this and onto something else, she's kind of already on the page. So we're very fortunate. I'm very fortunate in the sense that I've never, so far I've never had a situation where I don't believe something and Wendy does. But like you were saying, at the same time, I counsel people and talk to people all the time who are not that fortunate, who are in marriages where usually, they got married, both of them strong Christians. I mean, sometimes even like, again, the husband's a pastor of a church and all that. And then they start doubting and questioning, sometimes at the same time, sometimes one more than the other. And then usually you'll reach this crossroad moment where it's like, how do we keep going here, right? Because one spouse is still holding on to this faith, and one of them is like, I'm done. And everybody handles it differently. What I try to counsel people is, it's much harder if you have children. I mean, if you don't have children, it might be easier just to say, oh, look, fine, I love you. Let's focus on the things we love about each other. It's more about, like, for example, when I fell in love with my wife, I didn't fall in love with her theology. It wasn't her amazing, sexy theology, right? It was her. And so, focus on that. Focus on what you love about one another, the character and, all those kind of things. And let the belief kind of sit to the side a little bit. Again, it's helping people recognize. It's really hard for a lot of Christians. A lot of Christians, their belief, their identity is in their belief. I am what I believe. And that's really hard if you believe, if that's your mindset. My beliefs are part of my identity, which makes it even more painful when you deconstruct them. And so I get that it's challenging for people. When there's kids involved, it's usually a problem because then it comes to, do we take them to church? What kind of Bible stories do we read them, or stories at all? Not, bedtime stories. Are they just nursery rhymes, or are we reading them from the children's Bible about David or the Battle of Jericho or whatever, right? That's when you get probably the most kind of disagreement. The Christian, spouse is like, my kids need to know about Jesus. They need to go to heaven. We can't. And the other one's like, this is bullshit. Let's stop telling them about this. In fact, it's actually kind of toxic.
Yeah.
I mean, I know you. I think one of your videos you talked about. I know you're a parent, and you were at one time you were a Christian. You have kids. Well, my kids were my two boys when they were little, when they were really young. We got the idea of, like, for bedtime, let's read them from the Bible, just the real Bible. Oh my gosh, that's when you suddenly realize this book is not just R-rated, X-rated. There's incest, murder, rape, torture. Like, well, I'm not reading this to my kids. So there's certainly. It's legitimate to say, I don't want my kids exposed to some of this stuff. Yeah. And that's where it causes the most tension. And so in some cases, it's probably going to take more than I can do. I'm not a licensed therapist. You might need to go to a marriage counselor or a therapist or something to work some of these things out. And frankly, some marriages don't survive it, which is sad.
The good thing is, for most kids' Bibles, they do keep it very G-rated. Yeah.
They leave out the part where David cuts off Goliath's head and carries it around. That part's not in there. Yeah.
Or cuts off 200, kills 200 men and kills off the foreskins to get his wife. Well, it's funny you say that, because that was actually, I would say, I'm going to describe it and then clarify. That dynamic of teaching your kids the Bible was actually the starting point for what made me deconvert. Yeah. It was, the song Joshua Fought the Battle of Jericho?
Yes.
If anyone doesn't know it, it's just Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho and the walls came tumbling down. And a lot more to it, but that's like the chorus. But the story of Joshua, they walk around the city 7 times, or 7 days, and the 7th day they walk around it, I think, 7 times, blow the trumpets, the walls come down. Well, the bigger context is that they immediately go into that area, Canaan, and they slaughter everybody. And there's often a lot of taking of child brides, or worse, where the young girls, the virgins, were kept alive. But a lot of it is, of course, it's land theft. It is genocide, all the the bad stuff, all the stuff that you'd expect from Adolf Hitler, basically. Really, really bad Nazi-ish stuff.
Yes.
Slavery, beating of slaves till they're almost dead, bequeathing slaves to your children because they're property. And you, as I'm thinking about this, specifically about the genocide, we're just sitting there, as you do, you're trying to teach your kids to love the Lord, be little soldiers for Christ. And we're singing Joshua Fought the Battle of Jericho. And I remember just sitting on the sofa thinking, what am I doing? Like, what am I teaching these kids? And I will admit at this point, there were a lot of other issues that should have struck a chord with me. Now that I've out, there's a lot of other things that should have been like red flag, red flag, red flag. To my shame, I ignored them. And I can share that part of the story another time, but I did ignore a lot of things, and I'm sad about that I did gloss over them. I know that I didn't. It wasn't like, I know some people sometimes they'll read about the genocide and they'll be like, I don't know if I read that before, or the presage of slavery, or where God tells the priest how to perform an abortion with the dust water.
That's a great one.
It's
like, isn't that a great one to pull out when Christians are like saying God hates abortion? I'm like, really? Because there's a recipe for like how to have one. Right?
Yeah, how to create an abortion in the context of killing all these other kids, but save the young girls. But I was not one of those people who could claim that I never read those passages. I've met a lot of people who say that. I made several copies of the Bible myself by hand, and I know I read it cover to cover as well, several dozen times. So I know that I read every single one of these bad verses, and for some reason, in my, I bow my knee to Yahweh. I bow my knee to God. He is the King. I
Mhm.
let these things go, but somehow it's teaching the kids, and I think that's part of what was for me. I'm proud of is that when you think about this is now bigger than me. This is talking about intergenerational dynamics. What do I want to pass on and not pass on? And it began basically this splinter in my mind of this doesn't feel right anymore. Something's wrong here. I can't teach my kids genocide and be okay with it.
Nope.
And I remember saying to my wife, just a couple months after that, probably, and I did not think I was deconverting. If you would have said, by the way, could this lead to atheism? I would have laughed at you. I just said, there's no atheism's not even remotely on the table.
Right.
But I just said, I just want to let you know, I am doing some digging. I'm doing some searching, soul searching, certainly, but I'm doing some, historical searching, looking at passages and commentaries, blah, blah, blah. I'm digging. I want to know the truth, and I want to just put it out there. And I put it this way: I am more committed to the truth than to what I currently believe. And hopefully they're the same. Hopefully I can say
Sure.
in 6 months or a year, I'll have dug in, and the truth will amount to what I
say
did
that
believe.
you say that kind of assuming
Yeah.
that those two things are going to converge because they
Yeah.
have to. Right?
And I'll just be apologetically stronger.
Sure.
Apologetically meaning
Sure.
defending my faith. But that was my concern, was that I wanted to be more committed to the truth because, this is my argument, as a Christian, you would want the other people to say the same thing. Like, for example, if you're looking at a Muslim or a Christian or whatever, you would say to them, if you were, say you had a friendship with somebody, you'd want to say to them, look, I know you believe in Allah. I know you believe in Krishna, whatever, but just for sake of argument, my friend, would you be willing to say that if you became convinced that Jesus was the real God, not Allah, would you be willing to pursue the truth more than what you were taught by your parents? And you'd hope and pray that they would say, of course, if I get convinced that Jesus is the truth, of course I would go to him. You would pray that the Spirit would open their hearts to be willing to consider that possibility.
Mm-hmm.
And they would say it's theoretically possible, but of course I know Allah is the real God, so it's not going to happen.
Yeah,
and we would say the same thing. Of course, Jesus is the real God, so it's not going to happen. I'm not going to make him a Muslim. But you'd want them to be open to saying that I want the truth more than anything.
Yeah.
And it's funny though, but that statement to Christians is actually offensive. And I don't know if that makes sense, but to say I'm more committed to the truth than to Christianity is an offensive statement.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and the like one of the big disconnects again, because I'm very critical of Christianity as it stands, like sort of popular evangelical Christianity, and one of my criticisms of Christianity, sort of as we know it, is that it kind of takes this all or nothing approach, right? Every word of the Bible has to be true, or if one part is wrong, the whole thing's wrong. Throw the whole thing out, right? This all or nothing thing, and also this very biblically based idea, right? Everything has to be biblical. That's not biblical. Is that biblical? And those kinds of things. And I think that if that's your mindset, and it was my mindset for a long time, then any sort of realization that, well, maybe this Bible isn't so great. Maybe there's some bad stuff in it, right? And acknowledging there's some bad stuff in this. But you have a biblical faith, like your foundation is biblical. Then now, once I start shaking that thing up, well, that's all going to collapse because it was all built on that.
Yeah.
And so for me, and again, that used to be my perspective. Like for me, I take more not of a biblical perspective, but a Christ-like perspective. Because the problem is, let's make a list of things that are biblical. What I mean by biblical is these are things that are not only taught by the Bible, they are affirmed by the Bible. They're never explicitly condemned or forbidden by the Bible. And throughout history, Christians have used the Bible to justify these things: genocide, slavery, patriarchy, rape, like in those situations of these young girls that you capture, in a battle, and if they're young and they're virgins, go ahead and take them. All of these things, dashing babies' heads against the rocks, blessed are you, all these things. They're horrible things that are all biblical. right? Genocide, slavery, patriarchy, polygamy, multiple wives, all that stuff. All those things are absolutely biblical. I don't want biblical because that sounds like horror to me. That sounds like, are you kidding me? No, I don't want biblical anything. So for me, if I'm going to call myself a Christian, I think it should start with Jesus. And for me, if I start with Christ, none of those things are Christ-like. Slavery, genocide, polygamy, those things are not Christ-like. That doesn't fit with a Sermon on the Mount sort of starting point. And so for me, and again, this is very different. I understand this, but however, I definitely would argue, I think it's the view that the earliest Christians had, first, second, third century. And definitely when you look at church history and you see like the Anabaptist movement, which happened right around the same time as the Reformation, the reason why the Reformers persecuted and put to death the Anabaptists was because the Anabaptists didn't take a flat Bible perspective. The Calvin, John Calvin, Martin Luther, the Reformers took that flat Bible perspective. The entire Bible is all the Word of God, perfect and infallible and inerrant. Every verse in it is just as authoritative as any other verse. Anabaptists said, no, we're following Jesus. We start with Jesus. We follow the Sermon on the Mount. Those other books are nice, but in their minds, Scripture was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then other witnesses were Paul's epistles. And then there were other writings, which were Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, right, the Old Testament. And in that was a very different way. It's not flat Bible. It was a different perspective. It was putting Jesus and his words and following him as the center. And those other things kind of fell off to the side. And in any way, those other writings disagreed with Jesus, we ignore them.
Well, can I step back a second? Because you took a leap there that I'd like to dive into a little bit.
Sure.
You sounded like you were on a path to what I would call deconversion.
Oh.
And you did not deconvert.
True.
And I just want to read a few, these are quotes from you.
Yes.
You have said something like, the gospel is not about going to heaven.
Right.
I realized that the gospel, as I understood it, wasn't really the gospel. It's time to forsake church as we know it, for church as God intended.
Yeah.
You've and a lot of other things. You've talked about penal substitution not being correct. You obviously deconstructed hell. Assume you've deconstructed original sin.
Yep. Yeah.
You sound like you've worked through a lot of things. You've worked through canonicity, obviously, and I'm sure there's a lot of other stuff that's on the table that we haven't touched on. But you sound like someone who's saying a lot of this doesn't make sense. A lot of this is I think you said the word bullshit.
Yes, I'll say that.
This is nonsensical. This is certainly toxic to tell kids. This is my words, not yours, but it's toxic to tell kids you are broken and you're nothing without a psycho God named Yahweh who demands blood magic and loves to cut off the end of little boys' penises.
Yeah.
That sounds like someone who's in the way to deconvert. And instead you deconstructed, and I think you'd even call yourself a reconstructed person. How did you take apart all those things and stay a Christian?
Yeah, great question. Because I definitely did not deconvert, I deconstructed. Okay. And so and all my books that I've written in this Jesus Un series really is take sort of one at a time, focusing on some of these like hell, penal substitution, the end times, the Bible, church as we know it, faith and politics, those kinds of things, and trying to pull away all the bullshit to get at what I believe is sort of still a nugget of truth in there. So I think the reason why, like, I don't call myself, a lot of people call me, they'll call me a progressive Christian, but I call myself a regressive Christian. What I mean is, things like the doctrine of hell, again, so for 400 years, the church, the majority of Christians didn't believe eternal torment. That came up, like post-Augustine and guys like that, 400, 500, 600 AD, started to gain prominence because of the influence of Rome and Constantine on the early church, that kind of thing. So again, I take a regressive stance. Let's go back to before that. What did people believe? All right, let's look at that. When it comes to the atonement, right? Penal substitution didn't show up until the 1500s, 1,500 years after Jesus. Calvin says, I got this great idea. God is an angry, wrathful God. You are a wretched worm. God cannot, he hates you. He can't be in your presence. He's filled with wrath. He's going to destroy you. Jesus jumps in the way, takes the bullet. He gets the crap beaten out of him and tortured to death. Now God can love you and forgive you. That's bullshit because it just showed up in the 1500s. That's not the gospel. So again,
But
I
you
take
still,
a progressive approach. That what did Christians teach before that? Right?
you still
It's
believe
not
in
that.
Jesus as being important in some sense, obviously.
Absolutely.
What
Yes,
is he like? What is his importance? What's left? Like, what is important about him that's left if you take all those other things away?
right. So for me, yeah, I want to get back to who was Jesus, because again, I do think he existed. I agree with Bart Ehrman that there was a guy named Jesus of Nazareth. He did exist. He probably said those things that are in the red letters of the Sermon on the Mount, those kinds of things. There were the early disciples that within days of him being crucified, walked around saying, well, we think he's alive. In some way, he came back to life, however that worked out. So, and I even said this to Bart Ehrman when we had him on our podcast. I said, if Jesus of Nazareth isn't the guy who sort of said those things that are in the Sermon on the Mount, tell me who did, because I want to follow that guy. Like, I just think they're so subversive and radical and helpful and understanding, rethinking sort of like who I am and how I should relate to other people. And to me, it's helpful. It's true in that sense, right? And so that's part of it for me. I believe in an historic person of Jesus. I don't. However, so you asked me like why, even though I questioned all these other things and rejected all these other things, part of it is that I went back to what did the earliest Christians believe about these things, because I think these other ideas are horrible. Even like the second coming, the end times rapture, like that shows up in 1830, 1,830 years later, John Nelson Darby invented this idea of the rapture, Jesus coming back any minute now, and we have to build the temple, and the Antichrist has to show up. That stuff didn't exist until the 1830s again, right? So once you know this, you study church history and you see how things progress. I'm regressive. I want to forget all the garbage. I want to get back to as close as I can to the original idea. What was Jesus teaching? What was he about? What did it mean? And the orthopraxy of it. In other words, how is following the teaching of Jesus something I can do in my daily life, right?
Yeah.
I think it's really important that I care for people, that I love people around me, that I bless people, right? That, as you were saying, even when people on comments on YouTube are calling me a heretic and a false teacher and I'm going to burn in hell, man, God bless you. Have a great day. I hope you have a wonderful day. Bless your kids, and I hope all your dreams come true.
Exactly.
I just think that's a better way to respond.
Yeah.
So those kinds of things, I think it informs me. And so listen, if it doesn't inform you, if you're like, Keith, I get to the same place, but I get there following Buddha. Great. Do that. It doesn't bother me.
Can I ask, I definitely am not a debater and I don't ever want to be, but do you mind if I pick a few things apart with you and just
Sure. I figure we get to something like that at this point.
And I'll do it always respectfully, and we can always table a topic if it's something where we need to do some research separately and come back together. But I guess one question, you mentioned Bart Ehrman, I did too, but he would be quick to point out that there was no original Christianity. There were Christianities.
Right.
There were Christians who believed in more than just one God, that Jesus was Yahweh. There were Christians who said that there were two gods. There were Christians that said there were 365 gods. Christians. So there was no original like one Christianity, and also the sources of this are very, very varied. And I'm honestly doing a big research project that I hope it'll be at least 6 to 12 months before it's done, but I will definitely share with you when it's ready. But where the New Testament's quoting from, they're not known. I don't mean like where in Acts where Paul appears to be very clearly quoting a Greek poet, and you can kind of tell that's what he's doing, or where Jude says, the Book of Enoch is what it's quoting from. But I mean like where it's just woven in and you don't even know it's there, but it's directly quoting someone else. we know that there were between 40 and 60 gospels minimum. So
Right.
to go back to Jesus, it's like, well, let's go back to the Gospels. Okay, well, which ones? There's at least 6 different books of Acts. We know that they were in love with the book of Enoch. Enoch was to them probably more important than the Pentateuch was originally. And there's even some evidence that the Pentateuch arose out of the book of Enoch. So you've got all these different versions, these different books, these different stories evolving. And you mentioned that, Jesus's sermons. A lot of the Sermon on the Mount came from some of the books from that they described in Qumran. That you can see the Beatitudes are already there in some of the documents. So the Jesus character is clearly quoting from other sources. So it's not even like it's his.
Mhm.
But then you have other things, and excuse me, I'm not going to try to belabor this too much, but you get other sources. For example, we both, I'm sure, know Judas Maccabeus. He goes in and cleanses the temple.
Right.
Well, that appears to be a rewrite. That Jesus is a rewrite of Judas Maccabeus. You have the other stories where let me pull up my notes here. You get the sense that where is it? Get this note here. It looks like that. When you're talking about the 500, remember the story where Paul talks about the 500 witnesses?
Yes.
Well, there was a king named King Basius, who he was basically, it looks like Paul was like using King Basius as a one of his characters, and he had 500 cavalry escort him to Israel, and it looks like they became the 500 witnesses. You have in the book of Mark the zodiac portrayed in the right order of the zodiac signs. You have stories like Jesus turning water into wine, which appears very directly to be a copy of the Dionysius story. Even some of it is word for word out of what was written about Dionysius a long time ago. You clearly have Luke and Acts being dominantly a rewrite of a lot of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, where they're literally copying the stories from Homer, from the Iliad and the Odyssey, and just changing the story, changing the outcome, but otherwise it's the same thing.
Mhm.
You've got Paul in Acts taking the same route as Odysseus, where Odysseus goes here and here and here and here and here, and Paul goes to the same exact places in the same order. And so you're like, okay, you eventually pull this apart and you say, when I look at Jesus, number one, which gospel of the 40, 50, 60 gospels am I looking at? There's gospels where he's married. There's gospels where he's got kids. You've got all these things. And then you have certainly the other stories woven in where there are little nuances. Like, for example, they had two Sophia, there was the people of that day believed in two Sophias, where there was a Sophia that was very much like a mother goddess Sophia that was all wise. And there was a secondary Sophia who was like I'm going to get in trouble and then work my way back to being wise. And that's it. You see, Mother Mary and Mary Magdalene right at the foot of the cross. It's like you've got these two Sophias woven right into the story.
Mhm.
So many different stories, and Luke copies right from Josephus. You add this stuff up, and to me, like, I'm sure you've seen this, Pine Creek does it, where he takes like the Gospel of Mark and he says, okay, this is from this source, and he starts to just highlight stuff, and he says, okay, what's left? And when you get to what's left, it's like there's not that much left.
Right.
And I guess I would just ask, how do you find value in that Jesus, when it's clear that they were just taking, it's clear to me, that they were taking a bunch of different stories.
Right.
A huge amount of stories. Again, a lot more than I'm talking about now, and a lot more than I'm even aware of. But they're taking all these stories, Homeric epics. Pythagoras is a big one. John 21, 153 fish. Luke 2 with Anna in the temple. Revelation. Pythagoras is all over the New Testament.
Mhm.
They're rewriting Pythagoras. They're rewriting Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. They're rewriting the Zodiac and the Gospel of Mark. They're rewriting Josephus. What's left? How do you know what the real Jesus is? Even if there was a guy, and certainly there was a guy named Jesus, or lots of them named Jesus at the time. But how do you know what's left? And then the secondary question that comes to my mind right away with that is, if these people that created this story, they who came up with this stuff, whether they were talking about some seed of a real man who actually walked in the Galilee, or just making up everything, if everything was purely made up from an amalgamation of different stories. When you look at these people, you say, like Matt Dillahunty would say, why couldn't you just say, don't own people? Like, slavery's wrong, don't own people. I would argue that they're very bad men, usually men, who wrote these stories, who didn't have the ability to call very wicked things wicked, and who were trying to espouse some really weird things. Certainly they were apocalyptic, and that's some of the weird stuff there, but just even blood magic, why not? Why does this God figure have to have blood? Why can't you just say, I forgive you? All these weird things. And it's like we're adopting their spirituality from 2,000 years ago and saying, a bunch of you came up with this really weird story, and you had different sources that you clearly put together in a very jumbled way. It didn't, when you really pull it apart, it's like it doesn't really fit. Even like in the Gospels, where did Jesus clear the temple once or twice?
Right.
Was he around
before he went into Jerusalem, or after he went into Jerusalem?
Yeah, was he around for 1 year or 3 years?
Right.
And it's like all these things, they're not making sense, but they're trying to just do their best to make this story up for whatever reason. And they're clearly not condemning bad things. They're clearly not, trying to distance themselves from the Yahweh character. They're trying to say, Jesus says, I'm come to fulfill the law. So this Yahweh character, who used to be, the son of Elyon and married to Asherah, that Jesus is saying, I'm not coming to remove that. I'm trying to fulfill that. So they're not pushing away this polytheism that became henotheism, that became monotheism, that merged into Judaism or into Christianity. They're not putting any of that aside. And to me, there's some really bad man who wrote a really toxic story, and for whatever reason it took on. And you and I both know that if history had twisted just a little bit, we would be talking about Mithra right now, not Jesus. We would be having encounters daily with Mithra, not Jesus. But Christianity won the day somehow, and we inherit it. Why go back to something 2,000 years ago from some very bad men when we have the ability to go back to, like, there were philosophers right before it, Plato and Homer. A lot of this is copied right from them, as you know. We could go back to Plato and Homer and other philosophers and find the exact same teachings as the Sermon on the Mount. Why keep Jesus when we know he came from those sources, and those sources have the same teaching, or as some of your guests would say, Buddha has better teachings. What is? And I'm sorry that was long-winded, but why keep Jesus in the picture if he's so questionable and his sources all come from other places?
Right. Well, for me, he's not questionable, but I wrote down a lot of the things you were saying, and I think if you're working on a project where you're going to connect all those dots, I would absolutely love to see that. I've looked into some of those sort of parallels of Jesus, and the ones that I've seen haven't convinced me. But again, like I was saying earlier, so if there are problems, and I acknowledge there are problems in the text. We've been talking about that the whole time. There are problems in the text, but again, my faith isn't in the text. If the text is wrong, I will admit it. Yep, this is factually, these two things can't both be true. It's a problem. But it's not for me enough to say, well, then throw them both out. Because my faith is not in the accuracy, or my faith isn't in the book or the epistle or that story. For me, like I was saying, if you or anybody were to come to me and say, I think, we should love our enemies. I think we should bless those who curse us. I think it's better for us to care for the poor. I think it's more important for us to do all these things that, where I would say, I get those teachings from Jesus, and you or anybody else were to say, I get that from Plato and Socrates and whatever, I'd say, great, we agree. So, it doesn't bother me. Like, I'm not going to say, no, you've got to believe in Jesus. Sure. Now, most Christians would, and I get that, and most Christians that I grew up with would not be comfortable with that. They would say, no, you've got to believe in Jesus. And I would say, look, that's fine with me. It doesn't bother me. If that works for you, great, run with it.
Can I ask, would you say you have a personal relationship with Jesus?
Yeah, and I was going to say that, to me, is frankly the other factor. So it isn't just that I really like, when I read the Gospels and I read the Sermon on the Mount, I really like the way Jesus is subversive. And by the way, I think Jesus is way more subversive to that Jewish God and that Jewish system than you might think, than even most Christians think. I mean, when you kick off your whole ministry saying, Moses said this, I think he's wrong, and here's what I'm going to tell you. That if I did that on a Sunday morning at a Baptist church, they wouldn't say, Keith, you honor the scriptures. We just love how much you affirm the Bible. No, they'd say, heretic, false teacher, get out of here. But that's the way Jesus kicks it off. He's absolutely contradicting Moses, saying Moses is wrong. Even when he says the thing about where he says, God brings rain on the just and the unjust. That's a direct contradiction of a statement of Deuteronomy where Moses says, if you obey God, he will bring rain on your crops. And if you disobey God, he will he will dry them up. And Jesus says in the same place, he's already said, Moses, you've heard it said this, I say something else. He goes back and forth, correcting and all these things that Moses said. And then when he says, because God sends rain on the just and on the unjust, that's another little, and Moses was wrong about that too. Even when Jesus says to the Pharisees, a lot of times he'll say, Moses said, not God said. Moses said, that guy said, not God. So I think Jesus actually is much stronger. Even in that statement of I come to fulfill, not to destroy, but to fulfill. In that statement, so he says, I come to fulfill. Then he says, heaven and earth will not pass away, not one jot or tittle, until everything is accomplished.
Well, can I ask you? You're quoting Jesus as if it's Jesus. Would you acknowledge and agree that in the text and in the different books there are people arguing against each other? For example, Paul is arguing against the Paul faction is arguing against the James faction, and the Paul writes first,
there was a Paul and James.
And even within the text, there's people who took over. If there was an original Paul, 1 Corinthians, for example, there's people that added to 1 Corinthians to say, Paul wrote, this part, we're not going to add another few sections here and there to argue, to kind of smooth him. So Paul can say, on the one hand, don't eat meat, you're free to eat meat sacrificed to idols, because there is no such thing as a false God. It's only God.
Probably the real Paul who just says, look, guys,
do whatever.
Decide in your own hearts what to. He says it in Romans too. He says let everyone be convinced in their own mind. He doesn't settle the argument. He says agreement isn't the goal here. Unity is.
But in 1 Corinthians, then someone else says, "But by the way, don't do it, because we don't want to have anything to do with devils. That's the work of devils." Right. And so it's like, well, which one is it? Should women, for example, be involved in ministry, or should they be quiet and ask their husbands at home? Yeah. It's like.
So can I say something about that? Because I have talked a lot about this. I've written books on this. Like in those places, 1 Corinthians and Romans are the two places where we see this happen a lot. And you had Matt DiStefano on. He knows all about this too. He and I have talked a lot about this too. Yeah, so awesome. In Romans specifically, there's something called prosopopoeia. It's an argumentation device that Paul uses in Romans. And by the way, a lot of philosophers and argumentarians use this in the first century. It's an argumentation device where you have a mock argument with an imaginary person. That's what's happening in Romans. It's very clear all the way through Romans chapter 1, all straight through to the end of Romans 11. So again, this is the problem with opening your English Bible and saying, well, right here in Romans, Paul says this, my Bible says this. Okay, but most likely that little verse you're reading is the teacher of the law that Paul is using the voice of, and then keep reading and he'll contradict that. So it's if you don't understand that it's this back and forth debate between two voices, the teacher of the law and Paul, who's now a teacher of grace. He used to be a Pharisee. He's not anymore, but he knows how to talk like one. So he's presenting an argument here and he's refuting it all the way through Romans 1. And the end of Romans 11, he reaches this massive conclusion, drops the microphone and celebrates. That's the end of Romans 11. Yeah. That's one thing. So again, if you don't understand that's what's happening, it's confusing. Same thing is happening in 1 Corinthians. The beginning of 1 Corinthians, Paul tells you that this letter you're reading is a response letter that they sent to him. And they had a bunch of questions and concerns they wanted him to weigh in on. And that's why I think throughout the book, seems that Paul is saying something, but what he's doing is quoting back to them. You asked me about this, you said this, and then he responds to that. And so that's why in 1 Corinthians 14, this big famous clobber passage, after Paul has just spent 13 chapters giving very specific instructions about how women should prophesy in the church. He just wants to make sure they cover their heads, but they're going to be prophesying. I hate to put it this way, but men, if a woman stands up and prophesies, she's probably going to teach you something. Sorry. But Paul is telling you that this is absolutely acceptable and this is how it should be done. Then at the end of the book, there's a statement that says, and women should keep silent in the church as the law commands. Number one, the law never, ever commands that. Paul, a Pharisee of Pharisees, above all people, knows that. He knows the law doesn't say that. That's him quoting back to them what they said. And the next thing after that is a statement which most English translations leave out. It's one little letter in the Greek. It's a word that's an exclamation. What? Literally, that's what it says. Right after that statement is what? And by taking that out of most English translations, it just keeps on flowing to, did the word of God originate with you? Just pay attention to what I've taught you, and everything will go well with you. What has he taught them? 1 Corinthians 1 through 13, about how women should. So again, I get that there's problems on that. I get that there's problems in the text.
Yeah.
There are, but if you just read it again like a flat thing, if you don't understand the context, if you don't understand what's happening, this is why Christians are in such a mess. But it's not, I don't even want to say that it's innocent. I think actually throughout history, a lot of Christians have found it very convenient. Oh, good. It says this in 1 Corinthians. Let's just smooth it out a little bit. Good. And by the way, the pastoral epistles, 1 and 2 Timothy, do the same thing. I do not permit a woman to teach. Yes. Oh, good. Let's use those two verses and ignore the other 15 places where Jesus honored women, affirmed women, where Paul names like 10 different women and calls them apostles, pastors, teachers, evangelists. We know more than the names of more women in the early church than we do the men.
Yeah.
From actual letters of Paul, not the pseudepigrapha of Paul. So again, I have some passion on this. I actually was going to write a blog today about this very topic because it really pisses me off that we've gone from Jesus and early Paul, who actually were very pro-women, and we've now arrived at a place where women should shut up and be silent and not talk, and it's a boys' club. And I think I'm a regressive Christian. I want to take us back to that original thing because I think it was actually extremely pro-women, and we've now got way away from that.
Can I ask, going back to the regressive Christian thing, I'm assuming that, if you're going to believe that Jesus' character was real to at least to some extent, and he was actually teaching these things, that this wasn't just people who were using a character like a character in a play to make their own points, but that this is actually a real man teaching it. Would you say then, and agree, and I think you would, that Jesus did believe in Yahweh and say, I'm not here to destroy the law but to fulfill it? Would you then be comfortable with that Yahweh character being part of the Jesus story?
No, and actually I don't affirm that. So here's what I do affirm. And by the way, which the early church affirmed. So it depends on which direction you're going. And honestly, most Christians go the direction you go.
Yeah.
They go the direction of, this is God, this is Yahweh, Old Testament God, wrath, anger, genocide, split open the bellies of the pregnant children, and don't you show any mercy. And so therefore, Jesus is that guy. That is the exact opposite of what the Gospels say. What the Gospels say, Jesus says is, if you want to know what the Father is like, look at me. Okay, let's look at Jesus. Let's look at the prodigal son story, right? Let's look at the way Jesus, I forgive you. No wrath.
But if he says we're the same, I and the Father are one, wouldn't that mean they're the same?
It's saying the Father is like Jesus. That if you want to, so the Father is not like that God.
Well, can I ask this?
Do you think that I think that Jesus is bringing? This is why Jesus starts his ministry by saying, Moses said this, he's wrong. I'm going to teach you something else. Moses said this, he was wrong about that. I'm going to teach you something else. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. No, love your enemy, bless who's to curse you. He's reforming and correcting, and he starts everything off by saying, Moses is full of crap, and I'm going to give you a better way. That's why the book of Hebrews is all about contrasting the old covenant with the new covenant, the old priesthood with the new priesthood, with Moses, with Jesus.
Are you
Jesus
saying,
is better. There's
do you
a
think
better
Moses? Covenant. Are you saying you think Jesus was saying that Moses misrepresented Yahweh? Like
yes.
He was okay.
Yes, absolutely, unapologetically, 110%. Jesus was very emphatic that Moses was wrong about what God was like. The Gospel of John says that. The Gospel of John makes this radical statement in chapter 1: no man has ever seen God at any time. That means Moses didn't. David didn't, Jeremiah didn't, none of those guys. They never saw God. Jesus is the only one. In fact, he came to make the Father known to us. Why would we need someone to show us what the Father is like? Because we were wrong about that. Jesus came to show us we were wrong and to show us that God was always like Jesus. He always has been. We just were wrong about that, and we needed Jesus to come and show us. This is why I think Jesus is important. He's correcting this, and he's showing us that's not what God is like. I'm going to show you what God is like. He's humble, he's forgiving, instantly forgiving. Jesus forgives people. No one ever even asked him for forgiveness. They walk up to him, and the minute they come within earshot, your sins are forgiven. What do you need? He just forgives all the time. He doesn't need forgiveness, doesn't need bloodshed, any of that.
I will say, and this, I say this with respect. I think that interpretation of the Jesus story is ignoring a lot of the other parts of it. I mean,
I would love to have that conversation with you, Tim, because honestly, and all candor, like when I talked to when I was on the Truth Wanted podcast, it's an atheist podcast, right? With Objectively Dan, and before we rolled cameras, he and I were talking, and I told him a lot of times when I'm talking to atheists, I feel like I'm arguing with a fundamentalist Calvinist. Because they're arguing for the same Christianity that those guys believe. And they're saying, no. The Bible teaches this wrathful, angry God who needs blood. And I'm like, no, it doesn't.
Well, he's quoting often from
the same way I have to convince them. That's not what the Christianity is about. That's
but I will agree that the atheists often are fundamentalists, and I was a fundamentalist Calvinist. So the point may be taken. But he's quoting often from the Qumran community scrolls, which are, if you've read those, dove much into the Dead Sea Scrolls, those are much, they don't pull punches. They're like, we're here to fight. If you see somebody drowning on the Sabbath, don't help them out of that water.
But
you don't break the Sabbath. But he quotes, some of the Gospels do, but not all of them. And so we're picking which Gospels we want to keep, and which Gospels we want to say, well, those aren't the real Jesus. It's like, which one is it? Like, it's like, if those game shows where it's like, which door do you want to pick? And, that'll be a different challenge. You might win the prize. But it's like, which Jesus are we picking? Well, the Jesus behind that door is Jesus, who's somewhat nice and isn't into genocide and slavery. But this Jesus is, and this Jesus is a mixture, and this Jesus is different. And so it's like we've got.
But I would argue I don't have a Jesus in the Gospels who talks the way that Qumran or even the Old. Jesus also quotes the Old Testament. I would say. By the way, again, Matthew DiStefano has written a lot on this, specifically about how when Jesus is reading from the scroll of Isaiah, right? He reads the scroll of Isaiah, but he edits it as he reads it. He leaves out the parts about destruction and genocide and wrath. And so again,
in some Gospels,
he's editing. He doesn't read about the wrath in when he reads the scroll of Isaiah. He reads, if you can actually go to the scroll of Isaiah, and to the passage he's reading and follow along on the other side with what he's actually reading. And he comes to the part about the wrath and he stops. And Paul does the same thing. Paul will very creatively quote an Old Testament passage, sometimes radically change the meaning of it. And in the Old Testament passage, it was about the Gentiles specifically, basically getting rid of them and destroying them. But Paul takes that same passage, which is about condemning Gentiles, and turns it around in a place of God showing mercy to Gentiles. So there's a loose holding of those Old Testament scriptures. Yes, those scriptures are violent, but the way Jesus and Paul quote them is intentionally not.
Well, when you deconstructed the part of canonicity, how did you decide which ones to go back to decide which kind of Jesus was the Jesus you wanted to believe in? Like, for example, why didn't you go to the Gospel of Mary Magdalene or the Apocalypse of Peter? Like, why did you pick how did you pick the Gospels?
Southern Baptist.
Right. I mean, if history had gone a different way, and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John weren't, if they were the ones that got burned, and say the Gospel of Judas or the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, if they were the ones that you had, that'd be the only Jesus you would know about, right? And so you would say, if you want to return to the original Jesus, it would have to be those Gospels, because that's just, maybe if that was what Southern Baptists believed in, the Gospel of Judas, you would go back to that Gospel to get to the original Christianity. How do you determine where do you go for the source of truth when you've clearly done even more digging than I have on canonicity, a lot more. How do you go back and say, well, these 4 gospels are where I'm going to go to get the Jesus story, when there's 40 to 60 other gospels
Right.
that tell a different story, some of them radically different.
Yeah. So, I mean, so, we've already talked about the fact that, yes, we had other gospels, and in the the 400s, whatever, there was a canonicity, which I think was a bad idea. But again, there's still a stream throughout church history of the early church fathers, Tertullian and Irenaeus and Origen and Justin Martyr and those guys. And so they, and this is pre-canon, what they looked at was, they were saying, and again, a lot of these guys were disciples of the disciples. So they were disciples of Peter, or disciples of Paul, or disciples of the disciple of the guy who was discipled by Paul or Peter. So we have a historic thread and a narrative where they were saying the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Luke. These are the teachings of Jesus that we hold to as being the authentic teachings of Jesus. Now, having said that, I have gone to read the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which will fit on one side of a piece of paper and fold into your pocket. I have read the Gospel of Thomas, which actually isn't so bad. I mean, I'm getting a little, warming up to it a little bit more than I did, which probably is an accurate collection of the sayings of Jesus. It's not really a gospel; it's literally just a collection of sayings.
Yeah.
Some of them are mirrored in the Gospels of Mark that we have and Matthew. Others are new. Some of them may be the sayings of Jesus. It dates around the same time frame as the Gospel of Mark.
With what you're saying, can I ask, does it scare you that people, we don't know who did the canon, in the sense that we don't know them, we can't know if they're trustworthy?
Yeah.
Does it scare you, the unknowns of what if there's 200 gospels and they just burn them all? Does that kind of shake you up at all?
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, it doesn't.
It's like a black box, basically.
Yeah. It's a complete, what if? Oh, I guess if that happened, I guess that would be weird. And maybe that would bother me. I'm okay with the Jesus that I have in the Gospels. I'm okay with the Jesus that I see, testified in the early church and that kind of thing. So I'm okay with that. Again, but I'm okay if you're not. And sure. I'm not going to ask anybody else to agree with me on that. Yeah. But real quick, I want to get back to something. We haven't been dancing around this for a bit, and I haven't said this. And this won't help you, I'll just tell you, or your listeners. But I just want to come forward, come clean.
Yeah, please.
So there is a lot of discussion, and it's a worthy discussion about sort of the text and where did this come from, and is this blah blah blah. And I'm very fascinated by all that stuff. I'm very interested in that stuff. And I will say too, it's not settled for me. I'm always wanting the cement to be wet, and I'm always wanting to learn and grow and all that stuff. So I'm open to all those kind of things. But I have to come clean and say, way back you asked me a question a minute ago about, why am I deconstruction? I didn't completely deconvert and say, forget it. And it is because I had, from an early age, even before I had my conversion, at the Baptist church when I was 9 years old, didn't go to church, wasn't raised in before that time didn't go to church, wasn't raised in a Christian home or anything like that. We didn't read the Bible, any of that. And I used to lay in bed and talk to God. I didn't know who God was, but I would talk to God. And I felt like I had a connection with God. And in some ways, so then when I became 9 years old and we ended up going to a church, and that was part, for me, I felt like, okay, this seems like it's kind of making sense. Okay. And now I know that a lot of the stuff that came along with the baggage that came along with that, gospel and with that Jesus, I now have gone back and said, no, I don't think that was right. But I have an experiential connection with God, with Jesus, that at least I call that Jesus. Maybe it's the wrong name. It's the name I am comfortable calling that experience. Do
you feel like you actually hear God?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. And I have examples in my life where, a couple of times where I felt like God very, very strongly kind of spoke to me or had an encounter with God. And it's so because I have these experiential things, that's partly why for me, I've never felt like I needed to let go of Jesus. That's why, again, I've written a whole series of books called Jesus because to me, I can remove all these other things and I'm still left with the core idea of who Jesus was and what he was about. That to me is still valuable. And again, that's spiritually, I feel like I have some kind of a connection with God. Again, I use the name Jesus or Christ, whether that's the right name. Or I honestly don't think that God, if there is a God, I believe there is a God. I don't think that God really cares what word I use, what name I use. That is less important.
Do you think when other people have experiences like of different gods? So say if we were chatting and I was telling you about my experience, say with I hear the voice of Krishna come talk to me at night or so forth. Would you in your theological perspective at this point think that that's the same voice, like that it's just a different name, or how would you see that?
I think it could be. I mean, I wouldn't be quick to say, yep. And then you go, well, that voice told me to go out and, kill my neighbors. Okay, hold on a minute. Maybe not. So I wouldn't just say carte blanche, but I think in general, I get your question. Like, I do feel like, I do feel like there are, again, I feel like there is a God. I feel like that God does, that people can have a spiritual connection experience with that God. I think different cultures throughout history have different religions and understandings and their own sort of ways of making sense of what that is like, who that God is and what that God is like. I think just like Judaism, sometimes they got it wrong, sometimes they get it right. Even Christianity today, sometimes we get it wrong, sometimes we get it right. But I do think there is a God to connect with. I do think there is a connection that is taking place. People are having an experience with God that is genuine. We might all call it something different. But I've had those experiences. I do think those experiences are real. And so because of that, that's probably why, for me, I haven't let go of Jesus specifically.
Yeah. Can I ask just, and I know we've gone on for a while, so I'll wrap this up shortly, but just a few final questions. These are partly theoretical, and I know theoretical questions are always sticky. But if you did at some point down the line decide that based on your study and your reflection that maybe there wasn't anything to this, that maybe this really was all, without hopefully not being offensive here, but this was in your mind.
Sure.
This was certainly something that gave you peace, something that gave you a sense of a home base, so to speak, for your spiritual journey. But it was all in your mind. If you ever determined that was true, and that maybe this world universe is just like just the magical questions that drive us, like why is there something rather than nothing?
Sure.
Why is the universe mathematical? Just the things that why does the Earth happen to be in the Goldilocks zone, or whatever they call it? Like all these things that drive some people to a theistic perspective, and other people just to say it's certainly not a theistic perspective that's the answer, but we need to get better science to find the answers.
Right.
But let's say that you theoretically come to a point where you say, you know what, I don't think I need a God to answer the questions of why there's something rather than nothing, why I'm here. Would such a either an atheistic or at least a strong agnostic perspective, would it lessen your ability to enjoy life? Like, would you feel like you've lost the thrill of the mystery, or would you be able to recapture it and say, well, if we came from cells in the ocean, and evolved, and that there's no magic, so to speak, to it. There's no behind the scenes. There's no, for lack of a better term, there's no first mover or whatever that's called. No one hit the first domino. Does that scare you to think, well, what would that mean for the universe?
No, it doesn't scare me, and because I've reached a place where, in my theism, I believe in a God who is love. So I believe that there is no eternal torment to suffer. I'm not afraid of any of those things, and so if I found out the whole thing was not true somehow, which I think is difficult to do, again, because I think what we're talking about is, again, a certainty.
Yeah.
I don't, as much as I don't think I can arrive at a certainty when it comes to theology, I would say I'm not sure I can arrive at a certainty when it comes to atheism. Yeah. But let's suppose I could, and somehow I
not a certainty, but just a certainty that the theism was devoid of reality.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, what would I be afraid of? I mean, you know what I'm saying? For me, there's nothing that I would be afraid of. Now, as far as the question about mystery, I mean, I guess there's always something I don't know. But at the same time, and you can probably speak to this too, because I know people that are atheists. I know people that were formerly Christian who have deconstructed, deconverted, and now are not believers. And I think there is a measure of sadness for a lot of people. I mean, maybe it doesn't persist, but I mean, I know there's a season at least for a lot of people where they go through the season of, man, I really miss believing that there's a God watching over me. I really miss at night when I go to sleep, you know, turn off the lights, feeling like there's some God who's there in the dark, or, you know, and now I don't anymore. And so there's this sense of loss, and there's like, I wish that was, you know, there. I mean, so yeah, if I went through that, I'm sure I'd go through that too. I'm sure there'd be a feeling of sadness or loss, or maybe even fear of like, now what? Because if that isn't true, then what is true?
Well, I think for a lot of us, it's speaking for myself, a lot of it's the afterlife. The loss of the afterlife is very profoundly it's disturbing. Because if you,
the idea that it just stops, right? You just
like,
die and go.
You take your last breath and you're turning into dirt now. If you've truly believed that your whole life, and especially if you have loved ones that in your mind have gone on before you, and you're going to see them in the sweet by and by, you know, when you cross that river, and you know, we get there, we're going to have the best reunion ever. And you know, not necessarily in the theological sense of like, I just can't wait to see Jesus, so I'm like him, but just in the pure, almost selfish sense, like, I just want to live forever. I want to be free of the pain. I want a reward because I tried darn hard to live a good life. I want a little bit of a reward. Well done, good and faithful servant.
Sure.
And I want to see the glory. Like, I know that this life has been nasty in certain ways, not just like personally, but just like in human history. Like, there's been so much nastiness and violence. I want to see it restored. I want to see the New Jerusalem. I want to see what life's supposed to be like, and to realize none of that's ever going to happen. And when my last breath is up, that's it. For a lot of people, myself included, that is an extremely disturbing thought at first. And it can depress you for months if you're not careful.
Yeah. I mean, so what do you think? I know you're going to probably roll your eyes on this, but because when I mentioned it to Objectively Dan, he definitely rolled his eyes. But
I'll try not to.
It's just when I say the word quantum science, but the idea that, you know, that energy and matter, like, they never really go away, right? They just change form, whatever. Like, so forget the Christianity and whatever religion, you know, maybe it's all, you know, I think the specifics of it and the truth claims of it, or whatever, those things are up in the air, and we're never probably going to have certainty on those things. But you know what I mean? Like, so if I have a consciousness, if I am sort of matter and energy, and this body dies, is there a possibility that maybe in some way I go on in some form? I mean, I don't know what that looks like. For me, that's the tiniest, like, I think if I was an atheist, if I gave up on religion completely, I think I would still want to hold on to but just maybe there's still the possibility there's some mystical thing that we don't understand yet. Somehow there's some other dimension of reality that we leave here and we go there somehow, or who knows, if maybe I'm awake, I don't know if I'm conscious, I don't know.
Well, can I build on that with a question? If we know, and I assume you're not going to agree with Ken Ham and the 6,000-year-old Earth.
No, I don't.
So you would believe we evolved from other primates and so forth. If we're not the pinnacle? So in other words, there were other animals before us. We are an animal that's evolved. Consciousness is an amazing thing, but it is just part of our evolution. And if we could theoretically see 5,000 to 10,000 years in the future, humanity could look very different. If we can, keep ourselves alive. And which is doubtful some days. But if it worked, certainly 100,000 years from now, as we're hopefully traveling the stars in the Elon Musk starships, humanity will look very different. And we would perhaps look more like primates than what humanity might look like 100,000 years from now.
Right.
So if we look at that and so look backwards, we would say, well, I think as a human, I've got a special conscious connection to the universe. I've got a spirit that lives on. I've got something about me. Well, what about the iteration of humanness that was right before us? Like, what about the primate that was like the Neanderthal? Did they go on to some kind of afterlife or some kind of special consciousness? What about the pre-Neanderthals that were more like, real primates and the more chimpanzees? Well, what about the horses and the cows? Like, at what point do we say they don't get on to some afterlife? Certainly the amoeba don't go to an afterlife. So why do we suddenly, as humans, deserve an afterlife and they don't? I guess I'm just tossing.
Yeah, but I don't know. Yeah, and it's an interesting question. I don't know if we do or not. I've sometimes had the thought, like a lot of Christians will, in the scriptures, man is made in the image of God, and sometimes I'll think, do dolphins think they're made in the image of God? Like, I wonder if they do. Like, maybe they do. And are they wrong? I mean, what does it mean to say the image of God? Like, what is this sort of like life or breath or consciousness or awareness? Like you said, are there levels? I mean, there are certainly levels of life, right? A plant is alive, but if I throw it a ball, it won't run after it. But a dog will, or a cat, right? So a dog is alive too, but not in the same way the plant is. It's a little different. But I can't debate, Socrates with a dog or a cat, but I can with you. And you know what I mean? So there's life, but then there's sort of ranges of life, and but again, is it fundamentally different in the sense of like this sort of consciousness? I don't know, and science doesn't know either. Philosophy, can't tell you either.
Yeah,
but
Two last good questions. One of them related to what we're talking about now, and then the last one will be really short for the wrap up. Sure. You said God is love. I was listening to a conversation you were having recently with Matt about the octopus and
the
whole idea of you'd want to fight the shark to save the octopus, but the octopus was eating the crab. I sometimes get, on a similar note, I get intrigued. I hope this isn't a bad trait, but a while ago YouTube gave this suggestion to me for some reason of like a snake eating a frog. And I guess I never saw it, but I was just horrified to think these guys don't kill the frog usually. They kind of swallow it whole.
It's alive.
Yeah. And I found it very disturbing to realize that. I don't know why I didn't come across it earlier in life, but you think, probably, across the whole planet, probably thousands, millions of times a day, animals are getting eaten alive, literally eaten alive. They're dying inside a belly. They're getting shredded and torn. There's a lot of violence. And then when you add in all the human stuff, you think we've had a 2-hour conversation here. In these 2 hours, unfathomable things that we wouldn't want to think about have happened in these 2 hours.
Yeah.
And that would horrify us if we could see them, but they just happened. God is love, but he's not stepping into any of these things.
That's right.
How do you put that together? And this will be my last deep question. The other question is much more surfacey.
Okay. I'll give a brief answer to this question if I can, and then if people are curious, they can search it out.
Yeah.
There's a guy named Thomas J. Ord, and I know him, and I can connect you with him, and he might want to talk to you.
Yeah.
He wrote a great book on that question called "God Can't," and his perspective, and I kind of lean in his direction. His perspective is, again, if God is love, let's start with that as our assumption. If God is love, and then again, scriptures that say that. If God is love, true, perfect, pure love is not controlling or manipulative. And therefore, that's why God doesn't intervene in these things. But he's given us agency. And if we, have this sort of knowledge of good and evil, and we can see that that's bad, that's not good. People shouldn't treat each other that way. Genocide is horrible. Famine is bad. We should feed people and clothe people and, not do these things. Then now we have something to do about it. We have a way of sort of reducing that suffering in the world and responding and reacting to the horrible things that we see going on in the world. So that's the short answer. Like, so it's the idea that it's because God is love, and because therefore love is not controlling or coercive, that God doesn't intervene. So
I'm not sure what I think about that answer, but I'll save the response for sake of time.
Yeah, I just think it's not without its problems, but I think it's a better answer than most Christians have given me, which is that God has a plan, His ways are higher. That's horrible suffering that your mom getting leukemia. It's gonna work out, and you won't know what it is, but he's got some other good thing. Or the other Christian answer to that question about suffering is you didn't have enough faith. It's your fault. So on top of the fact that your loved one died of this horrible disease, it's really your fault, because if you had enough faith, you could have prayed and God would have healed them.
Yeah.
So those are the typical answers that most Christians have. That's what I've had to deal with most of my life. I think Tom's answer at least gives me, I'm more comfortable with that answer. Like, okay, yeah, because I do think God is love. I do think that love isn't coercive or controlling, and then it does put it back on us. It's Christ in you and me, the hope of glory. Christians believe that we are the incarnation of Christ in the world today, and so whatever we're doing or not doing is what Jesus is doing. And so we can't say, God, why don't you fix it? I think we've been told, no, you can fix it. What are you doing about it? So I think that's a better answer for me anyway, for that question.
Is the hope of glory, by the way, is that phrase from the pseudepigrapha, or is that canonical? That'd be
probably from Ephesians, right?
Yeah,
so,
which
probably not Paul.
Well, just to add an emotional tinge to that, I mean, think of we both have kids that we dearly love.
Yeah.
Think of the worst thing that you could imagine being done as an attack to a child right now.
Yeah.
And God could stop it all, and He does. And I know that that's not a new thought to you. I'm sure you've thought of that many times, but I struggle.
I would say God can't stop it. God can't.
He can't.
He's a spirit. He doesn't have hands and feet. He has no physical form, and He's love, and love isn't coercive. So in the same way, God can't lie, or God can't, there's lots of things philosophically God can't do if He's going to be in nature God. This would be one of them.
So you think God literally can't intervene in certain things?
No, He can't.
So he could not have stopped the Holocaust, for example.
No, we could have, and we know we could have, right? We know absolutely we could have, right? And by the way, America could have stopped it, because Shell Oil was selling an additive to the air fuel used by the Nazis, that they were the only source. Shell Oil, Mobil Oil in America, sold it to the Nazis. And if they had just stopped selling it, they would have shut down the Nazi machine overnight. So yeah, we could have stopped it, but we made millions of dollars.
Crazy. I know I've kept you for a long time, and I really appreciate your generosity with your time. I wanted to ask kind of a very much easier question, so we can take it to an easier end. The whole idea of these discussions, we've all had people come at us, you're an idiot. You clearly haven't read the Bible.
Sure.
I've had people literally. I've memorized entire books. I've memorized thousands upon thousands of verses. I've had people tell me, "You clearly have never read your Bible." People, you're bad. You're deceptive.
Yeah.
And one of the hardest parts about this is the idea of keeping the conversation open and building bridges, especially with people with whom we think their worldview is extremely toxic and even psychologically abusive to children. How do you you obviously have a very pacifist, peaceful nature about you. How do you deal with people, especially atheists, who want to come at you, who want to say, you're clearly, lying or deceptive, or you're not admitting the truth or whatever? There are people that just want to attack. Sure. And I'm not sure if you ever feel like you want to attack people. I don't know if you do, but how do you keep the bridges open with people, knowing that there's accusations of toxicity going back and forth?
Well, honestly, Tim, I don't have a lot of atheists coming after me. They're all Christians. And all the people calling me the names, all the people wanting to,
show you the love of Jesus.
Attack me. And what I try to do is I try to put myself in a perspective of, number one, I used to believe exactly what they believe for the same reasons they believe it. And I probably actually, treated other people that way, or at least in my head thought of other people that way at one point in my life, right? So I've been there, and I know what that feels like. So there's this thing that we sort of worked out when we were doing our house church, for like 11 years. We started recognizing this idea that everybody is in process, right? And I might be on some things farther along the curve than you are, but you're probably ahead of me on that curve on other things, right? So we're not all in the same spot, and that's okay. And so, especially then, if I encounter somebody who when I hear them talking and I disagree with them, but I used to agree with them, right? In other words, that was me 5 years ago. It actually gives me more grace for them. It should anyway. I mean, that's what helps me. There's a quote. My friend Josh Lawson, he says, I quote him all the time on this. So he said this once. He said, there's the funny thing about my worldview. No matter how many times it changes, I'm always right.
That's great.
And that is right. Every time I've changed my view on something, that's been my attitude. Right?
I love that.
But the flip of that coin is also true. And I try to hold on to this. I've been wrong before. I'm probably wrong about some things now. And guess what? I'm probably wrong in the future too. So I should give grace for myself a little bit, not take myself too seriously, because I have changed my mind before. I've been wrong before. I'm probably wrong now. I'll be wrong again. And so are you. And so let's just get over this need to be right, to prove to other people that I'm right and you're wrong. Let's just kind of go back to this place of, again, embracing some mystery and saying, this is where I am now. Here's what I think. What do you think? Great. I'll listen to you. I'll see what you think. Well, maybe I agree. Maybe I don't. I'm not threatened by somebody having a different view. Now, the problem, of course, with this is this works for me and gives me sanity. It doesn't work if the other guy doesn't play by those rules. And his rules are, you're wrong, I'm right. But again, that whole posture is assuming I'm not wrong about anything. In fact, in a way, what someone who behaves that way, what they're saying, atheist or Christian, if they take that position, in a way, what they are saying is, I am the standard for truth in the universe. I'm not wrong about anything. And if you agree with me on everything I agree, you are right. But if you don't, you're wrong and bad and evil or insane. So once you make yourself the standard for all truth, that's a bad place to be. I would just encourage all of us, Christian, atheist, anything, whatever it is you think you believe, don't become a fundamentalist. Don't hold so tightly to the things you think you know are true, to the degree that you justify yourself and you condemn other people. Let's hold a little more loosely to that, right? Let's just see I just see other human beings, right? I don't see Christian, atheist, Buddhist, Muslim. They're just people, right? And part of it is that I let go of this toxic theology that taught me to see people that way. So that's what works for me.
That's awesome. I couldn't have said it better. I love that way you put that. It's so important. And yeah, that humility, that ability too, to just be like, there's so much more I need to know that I don't know. And hopefully tomorrow I'll be a better person, but whatever my journey looks like, I need to keep a humility. And it's funny, when you're a Christian, you think, Jesus teaches humility. The Bible certainly teaches it over and over. Pride goes before a fall. How you feel like you've humbled yourself before this in the sight of the Lord, and He's going to lift you up. And then when you escape it, you realize even then you were so proud. We're so proud of what we know, the truth, and it's like I love how, and this is just my experience. I don't know if everyone would agree with this, but it feels like now that I've left Christianity, some of the best parts of it, like be humble or be loving or be gracious or be giving, they have exploded both in terms of what I feel like I want to share with other people and in what I've received from people too. But like I've received more grace, more acceptance, more kindness from atheists than I have from Christians combined in my entire life. And it's an interesting thing to see. And it's not the whole story. It's not a reason to deconvert. It's, experience is not the reason to convert or deconvert, but it's interesting to see it all the same. And I appreciate your willingness to have these kind of conversations, because we all need to learn from each other. We're all just trying to figure it out. I mean, that's what it's. We're all just trying to figure out what's this life all about? What's the best way to live, and what's the best way to leave this planet better than we found it? So, well, I appreciate it so much. Everyone, we've been speaking with Keith Giles. Again, thank you so much, Keith, for what you do. If anybody wants to kind of follow up with Keith, I'll have the links beneath our video, so you can check him out. Go subscribe, read his blog on Pathos, go to his website, buy his books on Amazon if you're interested. But Keith, again, thank you so much for what you do. Thank you for this conversation. And I do hope we can follow up at some point. I'd love to keep digging with you.
Yeah, same here. I'd love to do it. And Tim, thank you for hosting this conversation and being willing to have these kind of conversations. It's very important. A lot of value in that. And you're the kind of person I would love to have these conversations with, because the way you go about it, the posture you take, your willingness to listen, ask good questions. I really appreciate that. That's something we need a lot more of.
Thank you. And likewise. All right, well, let's do it again.
Yeah.
Thanks, Keith.
All right.
Appreciate it.